In one of the morning newspapers, worn by time and smelling of printer's ink, appeared the mysterious news that the Marquis de Manette, respected in high circles, was found dead under unclear circumstances. Whether it was an accident or a premeditated murder has not yet been established. Then on Monday, a terrible incident occurred. The Count, losing his balance, fell from a cliff and died tragically, which led to a deep shock among all who knew him, because no one expected such a disaster to happen so suddenly, especially on this day, when everyone seemed to be in a mood for peace and quiet. Sad news came from the military. An important officer, recently returned from leave, died tragically after a fatal fall from his horse during the morning dressage, when his steed stumbled on the dew-wet road and lost his balance. On Wednesday morning, the news reported a terrible disaster. A luxury cruise liner had sunk off the coast, and despite efforts to rescue the crew, the ship's navigator had drowned while performing his last duty before his sad death. And on Thursday, a young man who had received an invitation to a social tea party at the home of an old family suddenly died of a sudden attack when he learned the tragic news of the death of a close friend, and all deaths were published in the issues until the end of the week. The young noblewoman, dressed in an elegant dress of emerald fabric embroidered with pearls, sat by the window with a thin newspaper in her hands, thoughtfully reading the lines of sad news, as if trying to read in them signs of her own fate. Her snow-white hair, as if covered with frost, fell on her shoulders in soft waves. Her golden eyes looked warily and sullenly, and in her head there was complete chaos, because she did not understand at all why all this suddenly began to happen and where the threat of destruction came from. In ancient, long-forgotten times, when a dark threat loomed over a great and proud empire, a monstrous demon with many eyes and unimaginable strength appeared. No mortal could resist his power, and all attempts to stop him ended in tragedy and death. And then, in the midst of a terrifying battle, an unusual girl with pink hair, like the petals of a spring sakura, suddenly appeared and shouted loudly, commanding to stop the fight. Behind her back, white angelic wings spread out, shining with a pure heavenly light. The knights, who had fought with despair and courage, froze in place when they heard this voice. Their swords froze in the air, and their armor clanged as they knelt before the Holy Virgin, who appeared as a messenger of peace, hope, rest, and salvation for all mankind. This was not just a wanderer, but a holy virgin, capable of negotiating even with demons. She slowly folded her hands in front of her, lowered her eyelids, and, as if addressing higher powers, plunged into deep prayer, emitting around her the radiance of peace, light, and faith. After heroically saving a great empire from destruction, she finally found the love of her life. A nobleman, a stately nobleman, with a kind heart and noble features, and it seemed that they were the perfect couple created by fate itself. However, her bright, long-awaited, and seemingly destined future soon turned out to be overshadowed by the shadow of betrayal. From around the corner, like a ghost of the past, a woman with snow-white hair watched, harboring poisonous envy and ready to destroy everything. It was a former saint, once revered by the people, whose name had long since sunk into oblivion, but was still whispered in the shadows. Young Thisbe Louise Callisto, eaten away by her jealousy and great anger that a new saint had taken her place, taking away the glory, the light, and the right to be chosen. Using illusions, the evil Thisbe terrorized the new saint with terrible obsessions. Spiders, snakes, and dark visions that made her blood run cold appeared before her eyes, and every day she sophisticatedly tormented her in every possible way, playing with her mind. But the new saint, with pink hair, a shining umbrella, and a heart full of kindness, proudly raised her head every time, maintained her dignity and calm, and found a wise, bright solution to overcome any danger and destroy the sinister machinations of the enemy. Thisbe Louise Callisto, lifting the hem of her luxurious dress, embroidered with precious threads and silk patterns in lilac tones, ran quickly along the marble corridor of the ancient mansion, breathing heavily and frantically, looking back in fear. And suddenly, like lightning in a stormy sky, a ruthless, insidious, and desperately needed idea flashed in the woman's mind. She smiled quietly, raised her hand, trembling with excitement, and decided that if the new imposter saint disappeared forever, everything would return. However, her carefully thought out, cunning, coldly calculating, and meticulously constructed plan was thwarted too early, and the Supreme Council of the wisest elders, temple warriors, and priestesses made a harsh but fair decision to execute her. And the kind, generous, graceful, courageous, and truly blessed new saint lived a long, bright, and meaningful life next to the one she loved sincerely, the prince with whom she went through suffering and found peace. This touching fairy tale story of love, redemption, virtue, and the struggle between light and darkness received its magical title, The Flower That Tamed the Monsters, and was carefully recorded in blue leather bindings as a relic of the past and a hope for the future. 24 years ago, the main character was an ordinary student at a prestigious university in South Korea, immersed in her studies, dreams, and everyday worries. But one day, her life was cut short when she was hit by a car and died, only to soon wake up in a completely new, strange world. The baby, so tiny and defenseless, slowly opened her large golden eyes, sleepily blinking her long white eyelashes. Her gaze was full of anxiety and bewilderment, as if she had just woken up and could not understand what had happened and where she was now. The adult man standing next to her, with a cold look and restrained severity, carefully examined the child. He said with obvious disappointment that the girl in the cradle looked too much like her mother, and it would be better if she took after her father in appearance. It was the little girl's grandfather, gray-haired, reserved and majestic, standing like a bulwark of ancient traditions. He covered his face with his hand in disappointment, as if unable to hide his disappointment, and agreed with the butler, adding that there had never been true love between her parents. With her little hand, the baby reached out to the rattle that hung on the bed, and all this was reality. She really was reborn in a new world, in the body of a baby, feeling surprised by what had happened, but not understanding how this was possible, what had happened to her previous life, and what awaited her in the future. At the same time, she was born into a wealthy family, surrounded by luxury and prosperity, and the toy she reached for was made of gold and precious stones, reflecting all the splendor of her new world, in which she now found herself without any explanation or understanding. Disappointed and embarrassed, she clenched her fists and frowned as she realized that she was not only in the body of a baby, but also an orphan, without parents, without protection, as if her life was just beginning, and ahead was only a long and unknown path full of trials and worries. When suddenly she heard strange conversations from the adults, who discussed her as if she were something important, spoke of her as if she were a prophetic child, an oracle, whose destiny, it seemed to them, was predetermined by greatness and enormous importance for the future of the world, which was in her hands. Horrified and completely incomprehensible, Thisbe Louise Callisto frowned, her little heart clenching with fear when she heard the terrible talk about how this child was supposed to save the empire and glorify the name of his family for centuries, leaving behind an indelible mark. The girl was reborn into this world as a special being, possessing an extraordinary blessing, like a white bird, a new saint who became a symbol of a great destiny. A woman's life was predestined, and she was to carry within herself not only strength, but also greatness as a true chosen one. From the very beginning of her life, she was absorbed in learning. She was overwhelmed not only with books, but also with endless knowledge that was to prepare her for the great path that she was destined to follow. This knowledge became an integral part of her new life. Later, she was hired a tutor who taught her how to walk correctly, be graceful, and also possess everything that could emphasize her status and special position in this world, because she was destined for a great mission that awaited her ahead. When the woman clapped her hands, Thisbe Louise Callisto flinched and turned around in fear, feeling her attention slipping away as she was deeply absorbed in her thoughts. But the lady immediately reminded her that she was distracted and needed to focus so as not to lose the important moment. The woman shouted at her to gather her strength again and return to her studies, despite the fatigue that was felt in every movement, because the little girl felt the strength leaving her body and her attention became weak, which made it incredibly difficult to continue the study. Thisbe Louise Callisto frowned and thought, closing her eyes, her hand unconsciously reaching for her chin, and everything around her suddenly seemed strangely familiar, as if she had already lived through this moment, and it was returning to her consciousness again, leaving strange sensations. As soon as the little girl opened her big eyes, she realized where she knew everything that was happening from. Her mouth dropped open in horror as the realization came with stunning clarity, and it became clear to her that she was in the body of the villainess whose fate she had once read. She recoiled in horror as she realized that her sudden arrival in the novella world, where she now inhabited the body of a villainess, was not just an accident, but part of a new reality, and she felt anxiety creeping up on her as she now had to figure out how to get out. It had been 6 years since she had been reborn into this new world, and she was soon to become an evil aristocrat. But on her face was an expression of deep regret and unwillingness to accept such a sad end to her fate that was destined for her. For in the end, the villain she was destined to play was executed, and this inevitable moment loomed like an ominous shadow that followed her at every step, consuming her soul with anxiety and hopelessness until everything ended tragically. Thisbe Louise Callisto staggered back, holding her hand to her face, her eyes reflecting shock, bewilderment, and deep sadness, and her face turned pale as she realized that her life had gone wrong, and her own destiny was far from what she had imagined. After she frowned and tried to dispel these gloomy thoughts with a smile, she suddenly asked herself why she had studied everything if her fate was still leading to an insignificant and meaningless patronage that did not bring happiness. In fact, the real saint was not she, but young Estelle Iller, a sweet girl with pink hair, in a light dress, radiating kindness and light, who was an example of true purity and fortitude, the embodiment of what Thisbe should imitate. She was a distant relative of the villainess of the Callisto clan, possessed an indescribable beauty. Her golden eyes shone like the sun's rays, and her hair, like the petals of lovely roses, created the image of a mysterious and refined lady, attracting the glances of everyone around. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, decorated with exquisite patterns, and the guest, obviously, arrived at the most inopportune moment. His appearance brought with it not only a slight anxiety, but also a sense of mystery, filling the atmosphere with an anxious, but at the same time intriguing excitement. The maid bowed politely and entered the room, her movements smooth and delicate, her gaze directed straight at the girl as she asked with slight concern how much time was left before the reception began, trying not to miss a single important detail. The noblewoman was dressed in a new blue dress with exquisite white inserts, which gave her image incredible elegance and lightness, and white gloves, like a finishing touch, emphasized her impeccable appearance and high position in society, making her even more majestic. Thisbe Louise Callisto was almost ready for the reception. Her beauty could undoubtedly dazzle those around her, like pure white snow, and the inserts in her dress, with the image of a rose, gave her a refined and majestic appearance. She calmly informed the maid that in a few moments she would come down. In her mind, she almost cried, thinking about the fate of the villain from the book, who, being the child of an oracle, was doomed from birth to eternal suffering and unbearable torment, finding herself in a hopeless situation from which there was neither salvation nor consolation. The lady, with her head bowed, almost unconsciously allowed the maid to place on her an exquisite necklace, inlaid with magnificent diamonds, and gently adjust the precious stones that adorned her neck, giving sophistication to her image and shine. After careful preparations and hasty gatherings, Louise Callisto proudly walked forward, confidently striding towards her goal, followed smoothly and synchronously by her young maid, who, as always, supported her step and provided a reliable escort. Deep down, however, the lady felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude that her past memories had helped her see the true picture of life, and had also given her the long-awaited chance to change her destiny, avoid fatal mistakes, and prevent inevitable collapse. Standing by the beautiful carriage and looking at the coachman with a slight sigh, she softly said that she would like them to make a short stop at her favorite cafe along the way, as she wanted to rest a little and enjoy this moment of peace in complete silence. Suddenly, a newspaper with the latest news was handed to her, and, accepting it with gratitude, the lady expressed her appreciation for such a small but pleasant gesture, which was truly appropriate at that moment, and showed attention to her personal interests, adding lightness to her day. The beauty, having carefully adjusted her white hair, sat down in the carriage and settled down on a luxurious red sofa, enjoying the softness of the fabric, and her every gesture was filled with elegance, as a reflection of the refined beauty of her inner world, forcing those around her to linger their gaze. With a sweet, barely noticeable smile on her face, she gently touched the coachman, indicating to him that it was time to continue on their way. And, as always, her hands deftly adjusted her earrings with precious stones, and neatly pulled gloves glittered on her fingers, emphasizing her impeccable style. However, there might be talk among the other nobles, and someone might try to spread malicious rumors or make sarcastic remarks, forgetting that there was much more behind the royal person than they could imagine, which, however, did not bother her. The carriage, as if awakening from a long sleep, finally moved off. The horses, with powerful and confident steps, began their journey, and the wheels, with a quiet creak, began to move along the winding road, as if each turn opened up a new, unknown chapter before it. Thisbe Louise Callisto, confident in her happiness, believed that now, having everything she needed, she would work calmly in the garden, responsibly fulfill her duties, and avoid all those troubles that once arose in a woman's life. She had actually thought so before, but after a recent good walk, where she had felt various changes, the smile on her face had disappeared, like a glass veil shattering into pieces, and she realized that events were waiting for her ahead that she could not have foreseen. Soon, turning the pages of the newspaper, she discovered oddities that made her heart clench. People who, it would seem, should have died because of her fault, suddenly began to die from other causes, and in confusion, she read the articles, trying to understand what was happening. And the dream that once gave her hope for carefree walks in the garden, surrounded by flowering plants and the quiet sounds of nature, lost its power, and like fragile glass, suddenly cracked, leaving her in thought and the realization that the ideals to which she aspired were now unattainable. The noblewoman's soul, as if freed from her body, left her, and, absorbed in deep thoughts about fate, she leaned back on the soft back of the carriage, barely aware of what was happening, while her mind was still experiencing shock and confusion after reading the article that shook her to the depths of her soul. Looking down, the beauty plunged into deep thought, trying to understand where exactly she had made a mistake in her calculations, because everything that seemed so correct and simple suddenly turned into an unexpected mistake that shook her soul and left many questions. While reading the latest news in the cafe, she kept wondering where she had gone wrong, because it had recently become clear that all the nobles had learned that the true saint was not Thisbe Louise Callisto, as she believed, but Estelle herself, who was hiding her true nature, which she carefully concealed. A month ago, in the lands of the Empire, an event occurred that shook everything around. A huge monster, similar to a wolf, growled, filling the air with horror and fear. At that moment, everything collapsed, and everyone who could rushed to flee, trying to save themselves and hide from the unknown threat. And while everyone was saving themselves, only Estelle, standing still, was not afraid to stop and look the inevitable in the face, giving this terrible creature the opportunity to pass on, without showing fear, confidently feeling her strength and faith in her righteousness, despite all the dangers. The panic-stricken aristocrats rushed to the side in panic, trying to hide from the threat, their legs barely able to cope with the terrifying fear, and screams filled with horror echoed throughout the area, creating an atmosphere of chaos in which the entire large crowd was plunged. As it was predicted in the ancient books, Estelle did not lose her head, and with deep calm approached the wild beast, possessing those very qualities that could subdue even the most cruel of creatures. And a miracle happened. The beast submitted to her soft but strong will. After the threat was removed, Estelle, without losing her composure, turned around, looking around at everyone, and anxiously asked if anyone present had been hurt, carefully looking into each person's eyes to make sure that no harm had been done to anyone. At that moment, all the nobles stood as if spellbound, their faces expressing complete bewilderment and shock, because no one could believe that this woman, whom they had previously underestimated, actually saved them from imminent death, and they all breathed heavily, realizing the incredible proximity of the catastrophe. The beautiful Estelle, with extraordinary determination and unrivaled gentleness, carefully stroked the wild monster, which did not yield even to whole squads of knights, in whose numerous attempts there was not the slightest success, despite all their efforts and determination. Then rumors began to spread among the aristocrats that according to an ancient prophecy, the child of the oracle was to become a holy virgin. But, as it turned out, the Callisto family had been deceiving all this time, hiding their true intentions and the truth, which was carefully hidden from the eyes of others. All eyes of the aristocrats were on Thisbe Louise Callisto. Their condemnations poured in, and everyone called her a false witness, accusing her of not living up to the expectations placed on her, causing them to doubt her true role in their world. The noblewoman, to whom all these reproaches were directed, stood in her elegant red dress, with her gaze lowered, as if personifying cold determination and serene calm, silently accepting all the accusations and condemnations, not allowing the slightest emotion to reveal itself on her face. Finding herself in this position, she realized that all the years of female education, preparation for the role of the great savior, every effort she made was in vain, because her fate was already predetermined, and she realized that all her efforts did not matter in this cruel world. This is probably why the original Thisbe Louise Callisto fought so hard and persistently to have her efforts and determination finally recognized by those around her, to earn even a modicum of respect that she so craved. However, faced with condemnation and not finding support, the new girl, dressed as the main villain of the novel, did not feel the desire to justify herself or rush into quarrels, and, holding back her emotions, chose to remain silent, leaving everyone in the dark. The aristocrats standing to the side exchanged curious whispers and watched with undisguised interest to see whether the noblewoman would try to justify her actions, or whether she would resign herself to the accusations and quietly leave, leaving everything behind, including their ridicule. Meanwhile, the noblewoman, ignoring the whispers and condemning glances, walked past confidently and decisively, heading towards the brave Estelle, who stood nearby, with that calmness and inner strength that gave her the ability to tame the monster himself. Then, with amazing grace and softness, the heroine swept her arms around herself, as if touching invisible forces, and with a barely noticeable but touching smile, she said that her abilities were truly enormous, and this discovery surprised even her. Everyone present froze, stunned by her words, as they expected to hear at least some explanation or justification for her actions. But instead, she stated with complete confidence something that left everyone in deep bewilderment and great confusion. However, instead of justifying her actions or asking for forgiveness, Thisbe Louise Callisto, with a slight surprise in her voice, quietly said that perhaps Estelle really was the mysterious savior spoken of in the ancient prophecy. The nobles, stunned by what had happened, stood frozen in deep shock, unable to comprehend how the villainess, whom they had always considered cruel and merciless, had suddenly shown such incomprehensible kindness, leaving everyone in a state of bewilderment and great surprise. The beauty, restrainedly closing her eyes, feeling the tension that reigned in the air, thought about how bustling and noisy it had become around, as if the world had suddenly frozen, and all eyes, like magnets, were riveted only to her actions, attracting everyone's attention. Thisbe Louise Callisto, slightly bowing her head, said that in her opinion it would be better for her to leave, as the situation was becoming increasingly tense and unpredictable, and perhaps it would be wiser to hide so as not to become part of this strange and intriguing event. Estelle and the monster, frozen and not knowing how to react to what was happening, silently watched as the woman who had been their enemy just a moment ago, but now seemed strange, surprisingly kind, and at the same time viscous in her unpredictability, left. The beauty, feeling the tension gradually ease, finally sat down in a good cafe opposite a rich nobleman whose golden hair shone in the light, and whose strict and elegant formal suit emphasized his high status and refined taste. Thisbe Louise Callisto, feeling a heaviness in her chest, could not get rid of disturbing thoughts, because at any moment she could be accused of the murders that were committed throughout the city, and all the evidence and testimony could be used against her, nullifying her attempts to justify herself. Suddenly, something seemed to change in the air, and Thisbe, not expecting this turn of events, froze in place, amazed by what was happening. Her eyes widened in surprise, not believing what was happening and not understanding what awaited her next. Feeling an inner uncertainty, Thisbe looked up from her newspaper, so absorbed in the news that for a moment she lost all sense of reality, as if the space around her had disappeared and she had completely forgotten where she was, what place she was in, and with whom she was currently having this strange conversation. This handsome man was Sor Alman Salvatore, one of those villains that you write about in novels where exciting events constantly happen, and into whom one day a girl possessed herself, putting her hand to her heart, promising to change everything for the better and take back control. Slamming the newspaper shut, she said with a slight smile on her face that there was no need to worry. Everything was fine. Trying to hide her uncertainty, because what was happening seemed strange and completely unexpected to her, like something alien to her usual peace and tranquility. After she cleared her throat a little, the beauty added that she sincerely apologized for her inattention, and that she had been so carried away by an interesting read that she had forgotten about her surroundings. Although deep down, she felt a slight awkwardness and embarrassment about what had happened. Blushing, the man said with slight embarrassment that everything was fine, because he was a kind and nice person, adding with a slight smile that the lady often lost track of time, absorbed in reading the newspaper, forgetting about everything around her, like a true connoisseur of news. After a short pause, the man smiled again and added softly that everything was fine and that the lady should enjoy her vacation without worrying, because his caring attitude towards her left no doubt, and he sincerely wanted her to feel comfortable. But Thisbe initially made insidious plans, forgiving Estelle, constantly thinking about how to annoy her, hiding her real intentions under a mask of goodwill and outward calm, as if she had no intention of offending. And so, taking advantage of the moment, the girl resolutely turned to her lover with a request to make it so that the main character would fall ill and would not be able to participate in the final part of the festival, which, of course, would be extremely beneficial for her and would bring her a well-deserved victory. Without thinking twice, he agreed to fulfill her request and took the poison from her hands, intending to later pour it into the cup of sweet Estelle, hoping that her plan would come true and his actions would not lead to any unexpected and unpleasant consequences. However, at the moment when his great conscience and inner duty began to fight with his own intentions, the guy suddenly made a decision that changed the course of events. He drank the poison himself and then poured it into the beauty's cup, hoping to save her from trouble. In the end, the words of his lovely beloved turned out to be true. It was not poison at all, but a completely harmless remedy that could only slightly upset her health, and although he was ill for 3 days, he soon recovered, and everything returned to normal. Then, with some inner calm, he carefully poured the poison into his cup of hot tea, completely unaware that this very moment would be a turning point and that the consequences of his actions would be far more unexpected and tragic than he could have imagined. As soon as the poison came into contact with the black tea, an instant transformation occurred, and the previously harmless and calm drink became a deadly poison, which caused Estelle to suddenly lose consciousness, falling into a faint without having time to understand what exactly had happened. The girl was deeply outraged by how Sor Alman Salvatore, despite all the obvious cruelty of his beloved, continued to protect her until the very end, even if she was a real villain, which seemed to her a manifestation of betrayal and weakness. The young man, being a true nobleman, was not only outwardly handsome and impeccable, but also innocent in his actions, ideal in his behavior, with natural grace, radiating kindness, honesty, and sincerity, which made everyone admire him and his inner world. In her mind, being a charming noblewoman, she forgave herself for those moments when she had previously considered him stupid, when she had underestimated his true qualities and believed that he was incapable of understanding or understanding complex things, which now seemed to her a profound delusion. Suddenly, one of the noblemen, who was sitting opposite at the table, with slight surprise and without hiding his curiosity, noted that he had never before seen a lady so excited just from reading an article in the morning newspaper, and with lively interest asked what had shaken and excited her so much. Sor Alman Salvator clasped his hands in front of him, interlaced his fingers, and without raising his eyes, and with a heavy sigh said that it was inexpressibly hard and bitter for him to see his beloved so sad and broken, because her tears were more painful to him than any wounds or losses. The girl, squinting from the unbearable light emanating from the figure of the young man, felt a sudden stab of jealousy and resentment, as if this bright, shining image was capable of blinding everyone around and carrying someone's soul away from her heart forever. The man, as if he had descended from heaven or fallen from a golden sleep, struck the imagination with his noble appearance. Golden hair flowed like solar threads, facial features were perfect, and in his kind, shining gaze, one could read a purity inherent only in a true angel. The woman's hands, graceful, well-groomed, and slightly trembling from inner excitement, as if seized by an invisible anxiety, extended a newspaper to the interlocutor, gently touching its edges, and with a confident but wary movement pointed to the desired article, as if conveying not just news, but something important. Sor Alman Salvator, accepting the newspaper with a slight bow of his head and a reserved expression on his face, began to carefully read the lines which reported that the esteemed Marquis had died tragically in a terrible catastrophe, and although the official report spoke of a banal accident, the lady, with a thin line on her forehead, noted with alarm that it was very odd that the accident had happened before the carriage's wheel had fallen off, since that part had been listed as the main cause of the tragedy, while the boy, frowning, added that the carriage was brand new. Thisbe Louise Callisto nodded her head in silent agreement, remembering another recent accident where a vehicle had just as suddenly and suspiciously plunged down a slope, in very similar circumstances, and there was more than just alarm in her voice, but deep concern. Coldly pressing his lips and frowning, the man looked ahead with a stern expression and angrily asked if this stupid, ignorant crowd seriously dared to blame his sweet, noble beloved for all the accidents, mishaps, and even deaths. Thisbe Louise Callisto looked away, slightly averted her eyes, as if not wanting to say the obvious out loud, and, sighing heavily, she restrainedly agreed that, although everything looked like a chain of unrelated tragedies that at first glance resembled a simple coincidence, anxiety was growing inside her. However, during events where the lady tried to behave with restraint and nobility, behind her back there were constantly the poisonous, gossiping voices of other nobles who with a haughty grin declared that she was lying when she called herself a saint, and that something much more dangerous was hidden behind her angelic appearance. People were dying, and no one could understand why. Car accidents happened suddenly. Tragic incidents followed one after another, and only bloody footprints on the cobblestones, broken carriages, fallen wheels, and screams in the night remained silent witnesses of the impending disaster. The noblewoman, with obvious sadness on her face, slowly lowered her eyes, unable to contain the growing feeling of heaviness in her chest, and with a sad thought to herself, she decided that, probably, happiness was not the luxury that fate itself had ever prepared for her. After it became known that it was Estelle who had been recognized as a true saint, Thisbe Louise Callisto was left alone, as if displaced from the circle of favor and trust. She might be formally greeted at balls or meetings, but no one else sought to be near her. The young man, without uttering a word or looking away for a moment, continued to read the newspaper with concentrated persistence, and his gaze remained grimly focused, as if each line only kindled in him new doubts, worries, and a quiet but dangerous rage. Thisbe Louise Callisto, noticing the tension of her interlocutor, quickly tried to calm him down, gently placing her hand on his wrist and telling him not to worry so much, because she was not one of those who gave in to other people's glances. A light, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. The young man, having listened attentively to her words, thought for a moment, but soon could not restrain himself from objecting, expressing his sincere concern, because he could not help but worry about her, especially when he knew that she was being condemned behind her back, and this could not help but cause him great anxiety. When the young man, feeling a growing desire to express his sympathy and support the lady, opened his mouth to console her, she, with a barely noticeable smile, gently interrupted him, assuring him that she was all right and that he should not worry. The young aristocrat, with noticeable doubt and anxiety in his voice, replied that his beloved always told him that everything was fine and that he should not worry, but deep down he was beginning to doubt, because the fear that she was hiding the truth tormented him. Thisbe Louise Callisto, thanking him for his concern, smiled slightly, but her gaze became determined and firm when she insistently repeated that she was indeed fine, and that there was no reason to worry, because she was quite capable of handling the situation. After that, she smiled broadly. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and, with a slight hint of mockery in her voice, she declared that her goal was to catch the real criminal hiding among them, and that she was confident that she would cope with this task, despite all the difficulties that awaited her. With her arms folded across her chest and deep in thought, the beauty realized that in order to avoid the inevitable execution, she had only one option left: to run, or rather, to escape from the guillotine, which was already impatiently awaiting her as the inevitable and terrifying end of her fate. A few days ago, Thisbe Louise Callisto was lying in her bed, tossing and turning restlessly, unable to find peace, her eyes tightly closed, and her brows, as if radiating anxiety, were deeply furrowed, reflecting her inner struggle and anxiety that did not leave her even at night. Suddenly, unable to lie still any longer, the girl rolled over onto her back, sighed heavily, crossed her arms over her chest, and wondered how the book had turned out to be so cruel and merciless to the main character, because it seemed she deserved much more than such a cruel fate. Unlike the original, where Thisbe Louise Callisto shamelessly did a lot of nasty and mean things to the main character, this time the girl behaved nobly, calmly gave the title of Saint Estelle, and silently left, without demanding anything in return. Covering her face with her hand, as if wanting to hide from her own thoughts, the beauty plunged into thought and came to the conclusion that, in theory, the main character should not have had any anger or hatred towards her. After all, she had done nothing wrong and had not given any reason for enmity. However, despite her calm, restraint, and refusal to fight for the title, Thisbe Louise Callisto was subjected to cruel persecution from other aristocrats. Behind her back, there were constant whispers, gossip, rumors. Her actions were questioned, and her actions were condemned. Thisbe Louise Callisto was well aware that if the persecution did not stop and the murder charges continued to mount, her carefully thought-out escape plan, on which she had placed her last hope, was doomed to fail, and she would find herself finally trapped with no escape. But just recently, she had been married to that same fair-haired young man who sincerely loved her, cared for her, and was ready to do anything for her, even what other men would consider recklessness or shame. He was the light in her difficult fate. This was the case in the original book, and it is likely that the Callisto family will now be used again, quickly marrying off a girl to a wealthy aristocrat to strengthen the family's position and secure his support, regardless of her feelings or past. After these thoughts, the beauty cast a long and thoughtful glance through the window at the gray streets, covered in early fog, and suddenly caught herself thinking, where is her lover now? Is he alive, and does he remember her? Or did he also believe the rumors and turn away at the decisive moment? This young man was kind, noble, truly handsome, and there was not a drop of falsehood in him. He deserved sincere respect, care, affection, and that deep, warm love that she, perhaps, never had time to give him in full, getting lost in the intrigues and forced compromises of the past. And suddenly, as if lightning had pierced her thoughts, she remembered one unusual lesson from her childhood. Then, naive and dreamy, she asked a strict but wise teacher if there was a place in the world where one could live a carefree life, far from condemnation. Without another word, the teacher raised her pointer and calmly pointed to the board, where an old map, darkened by time, was drawn, and her finger stopped on a tiny city, surrounded by high protective walls, hidden behind dense forests, almost like a fairy tale, but as if it were real. Shocked by this memory, Thisbe Louise Callisto's eyes widened and her heart beat faster for a moment. How could she have forgotten about this place? About her delight at that time? About that tiny, almost mythical hope that suddenly lit up in her eyes, like the light of a distant star beckoning to follow? A tiny country, lost on the old map, looked more like a large, green city than a full-fledged kingdom. It was squeezed between two powerful states and practically erased from the memory of most people, like a myth or a forgotten legend. Only a few, those who possessed true magic, who sensed the flows of mana and knew how to handle ancient sorcery, recognized themselves as part of her people and called that place their home, hidden from the eyes of ordinary people, concealed behind a veil of secrets and great magic. Suddenly, Lady Thisbe Louise Callisto sat up straight in bed, as if awakened by a sudden truth, and in her palms a forgotten divine power flared up. Golden sparks, bright and shining like drops of sunlight, played in her fingers, which until now had hidden this gift from everyone. Estelle, her rival and light opposite, also had the gift of magic and could sense the flows of mana. But, unlike Thisbe, she preferred the strictness of structures. She used spells, memorized, clear, like formulas from ancient books, while Thisbe herself drew strength from intuition. But the vast majority of people did not even suspect the existence of divine power or true magic, because sorcerers hid their art from prying eyes for centuries, fearing persecution, envy, and the destructive consequences of the outside world's interference in the secret balance. In the original version of the novel, Thisbe Louise Callisto accidentally used witchcraft in a moment of great emotional stress, and then, shocked by what was happening, she sincerely believed that she was a real saint, chosen from above and endowed with a special gift. However, after a while, looking at her palms, in which there was neither light nor revelation, but only the ashes of doubt, she realized with bitterness that everything was a lie, beautiful but deceptive. Her strength was not a blessing, but a quick reaction, and she herself was not the truth, but a fake, a faded copy of who she dreamed of being. With the stubbornness that only comes from those who refuse to give in to fate and are ready to go to the end, the lady slowly clenched her hand into a fist in front of her, and a self-confident, almost daring smile played across her face, full of determination, fire, inner faith, and hope. Secretly, away from prying eyes, in the silence of her chambers and under the light of night lamps, she sat for long hours at an old wooden table, filled with ancient books covered in dust, secrets, magical symbols, and knowledge that had been hidden from ordinary people for centuries. Eventually, through hard work, constant persistence, and a deep belief in her own abilities, young Thisbe Louise Callisto was able to achieve amazing magical mastery, learning to control the energy of the elements and the light of divine power with grace and power. The noblewoman frowned, deep in thought. As in the original story, the main villain died from cruelty, unable to realize that her incredible powers were a curse and not a blessing, which reminded her how important it was to not lose control of herself. Thisbe Louise Callisto, with deep concentration once again, opened her little green book, which was as old as her own past, and each page was imbued with knowledge of magic that allowed her to better control the powers of witchcraft. Sitting on her bed, surrounded by silence, the lady thought that perhaps it would be better if her family turned away from her and she was forced to leave her family, because the absence of worries and obligations could be her deliverance from everything that held her captive, and this was a tempting option. With slight irritation and determination on her lips, the beauty reflected that in order to finally escape abroad and start a new life, she needed to clear herself of all charges, and only if her crimes were forgotten, she would be able to leave her homeland without obstacles, starting everything from scratch. And so, when her lover tenderly kissed her hand, the noblewoman thought that perhaps she should have caught the real criminal guilty of the murders faster, because only then could she escape and start a new life, free from fear and persecution, leaving everything behind. Suddenly, the girl shuddered, hearing the words of her companion, who asked with alarm in his voice whether she really intended to catch the killer, and whether she was ready to face this nightmare, because everything was becoming more and more confusing and dangerous, like a labyrinth with no exit. After these words, the aristocrat added that it would not be so easy to catch the culprit, because his tracks were lost in the fog. And then, taking her hand, he put it to his cheek, as if trying to give her comfort and show that he would be there, despite all the difficulties and threats that they were experiencing. With a slight smile on her face, Thisbe Louise Callisto, feeling his excitement, understood why this young man was so worried about her, because his concern was sincere, and despite all the obstacles, he was ready to support her in this difficult moment, confirming his affection and loyalty to her decisions. Thisbe Louise Callisto calmly took a sip of her tea, enjoying the warmth of the drink, and then added that she was indeed good at swordsmanship, and perhaps it would help her in the future if she had to defend herself or deal with any threat that might come her way. Her feminine hand, holding the cup, placed it carefully on the saucer, and the aroma of tea filled the room, creating an atmosphere of peace and solitude in which Thisbe felt more confident, despite all the worries and threats she had to face. The lady froze for a moment, awkwardly placing her hands in front of her, and with surprise on her face, smiling softly, she began to wonder if she had really once said such words, and now she herself felt a strange bewilderment, trying to understand what she really felt at that moment. Sor Alman Salvator, watching her reaction carefully, looked at her with deep respect. His gaze was stern, but at the same time understanding, as if he knew that memories and feelings can change, but the true essence of a person remains unchanged, despite all the trials. The beauty, noticing that the words were not understood as she wanted, began to wave her hand in the air, justifying herself that perhaps she was not entirely right, and all these deaths were just an accident, that everything could have been a misunderstanding, nothing more. And it was difficult for her to admit that her feelings were distorted by fear. Then she placed her hand carefully on the edge of the table, as if trying to find inner confidence, and said quietly that she could neither criticize nor blame anyone, since in fact there was no evidence that there was a real killer, or that she could be involved in it. The piece of paper she was holding in her hands was crumpled into a ball, as if the very thought of what was happening oppressed her, and without further ado she threw it onto the floor, releasing at that moment her emotions, which she could no longer contain, as if all her doubts and fears were extinguished in one sharp movement. With a mocking grin on his face, Sor Alman Salvator seemed not to have expected such a turn of events, and suddenly, with a slight subtext, he declared that the editorial board of the newspaper, which, as it turned out, was in debt, could very soon go bankrupt, and all this would become known, revealing secret connections and problems. It was a real shock for the lady. She covered her mouth with her hand, not believing what she heard, and, with trembling lips, asked the interlocutor if it was true, unable to believe that such important information had been hidden for so long, and no one knew about such problems that she could not even suspect. The house, located in a cozy corner, was ordinary, wooden, with a roof that, despite its simplicity, was a symbol of stability, which only emphasized the contrast with what was happening in her life, and was becoming more and more strange and uncertain. The noblewoman, who had lost all illusions, stood with a cold gaze directed into the distance, as if at that moment, having finally realized everything, she realized that everything she had thought until now was just part of the game, and now the time had come to calm down and accept reality as it is. The blonde, who was watching her, noticed that the lady seemed pleased with this news, and, smiling slightly, she replied that it would be nice if the editors of the newspaper were punished for their false news and for the humiliation they had caused, since the truth had to come out. With a cold, sharp look in his blue eyes and a cheeky smile, the man seemed to know that his words could hurt, but still answered her with a confident and cool intonation that it would be so if this is really what she wants. If, of course, she is sincerely determined to do so. Thisbe Louise Callisto, deep in thought, confidently and decisively said that in this case, their only correct path was to catch the real criminal who would be guilty of the murders in order to prove his innocence and restore his honor. The blonde, watching her determination, slightly tilted her head, listening to her words with curiosity, and then with a slight grin added that it was clearly evident that she was determined to conduct a serious investigation, and she proudly confirmed her opinion, demonstrating complete confidence in her abilities. The girl, slightly bowing her head, and with full awareness of the situation, explained that it was necessary to dispel the false accusations that could put her in danger, because if she was framed for all the crimes, it could lead to a tragic outcome. The next victim in the novel's plot was supposed to be the Count's son, a young gentleman with an inferiority complex, proud, but not a very good person, which made his inner world confusing, creating problems for everyone around him, because his difficult character caused discontent among those around him. However, the problem was not the guy, but his father, a count with a thick beard who decided to turn his back on Thisbe, which, of course, significantly complicated the development of the whole situation and led to unexpected consequences, turning the conflict into a real labyrinth from which it was not so easy to find a way out. He was an outstanding man who had previously fought monsters on the border, sword in hand, defending his land and his honor. But behind the outward heroism lay a deep personal tragedy that had complex consequences, causing not only respect but also fear among those who knew him. And it was this aristocrat who caused Thisbe Luaz Callisto to die. And moreover, she was despised by her own family, which only added to her suffering and became part of the tragedy that destroyed her life, leaving her in the shadows without support and protection. The lady's hand tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table, her white glove making almost no noise against the wood, while her thoughts were focused on the possible consequences that might occur if disappointment could not be avoided, and if she could not change the course of events. The lady thought that if the Count turned against her before the truth was revealed, everything could end in disaster, and Thisbe Louise Callisto would find herself accused of crimes she had not committed, which would be the final blow to her reputation. Suddenly, the lady realized that she felt relief, because despite the death of other people, she was not responsible for it, and although her conscience still tormented her, this thought brought her at least a little comfort, and the man, noticing her worries, clarified what her problem was then. The lovely lady explained that everyone would immediately think that she would be the one to blame for the deaths, and would make her the scapegoat, forcing her to bear responsibility for crimes to which she had nothing to do, which put her in a hopeless situation. The handsome man protested, assuring her that he did not condemn her and did not believe that she could be a murderer. He was completely on her side, deeply confident in her innocence, ready to defend her honor to the last, despite all the accusations she faced and the difficulties that arose on her path. Sor Alman Salvator suddenly smiled brightly. A blush came to his cheeks, and his eyes sparkled, and he said that he now understood. The problem was that each new murder was clearly not happening randomly, and events were unfolding according to a very suspicious scenario. But somehow the young man came to the conclusion that if people died for a reason not related to the lady, then no questions would arise for her, and no one would blame her, because then everything would turn out in a completely different light, where she would remain innocent, and her name would not be on this sad list. The awkwardly beautiful woman froze, not understanding why Sor Alman Salvator had brought up the subject, and her thoughts became confused the moment he broke the silence again, as if her feelings for him were already beginning to question her own certainty about what was happening. The man took the cup, took a sip of aromatic tea, and explained that he had simply assumed, as if he had not had a terrible expression on his face a couple of minutes ago, adding that his thoughts did not concern accusations, but only hypotheses to understand the essence of what was happening, and perhaps suggest the path to the truth that she was so desperately looking for. After which, he said that he would help find the real criminal, catch him and punish him, which was an unexpected and encouraging offer for her, which she could not count on in any way. And it was not just a word, but a promise that could change her entire destiny, bringing light into her dark days. For the noblewoman, this was a real shock, because she did not expect that a man she barely knew would agree to help her in such a difficult and dangerous matter, which would become her salvation and a chance for truth, opening doors for her that she did not even dare to dream of. With a smile, the noblewoman replied that she was immensely grateful to him for the offer, which meant not only support, but also a chance to change her fate, to return to her the honor and peace that she so desperately sought in this confusing world, where every shadow seemed a threat. Evening came, and the young man left, leaving her alone in the village, where the sun sank beautifully below the horizon, painting the sky in golden-orange hues, like the last gift of the passing day, filling the world with an atmosphere of calm and peace. His dear beloved was always surrounded by a crowd of people, and this endless bustle exhausted her, making her feel lonely among all these looks and opinions that did not give her peace, but only aggravated her inner fatigue, hiding her true desires behind a mask of indifference. The young man raised his gaze, fixing it on his lovely lady, and thought about the fact that she, it seemed, did not fully realize the truth hidden behind all these events, because her anxiety was caused not only by external circumstances, but also by internal doubts that she was afraid to admit even to herself. The young noblewoman smiled at him tenderly, and, feeling that the time had come for parting, said that it was time for them to go home, for the night was already near, and each must return to his own affairs, leaving behind these moments of farewell, full of great tenderness and gentleness. The young Sor Alman Salvator thanked his kind lady for the meeting. The man's voice was filled with sincere warmth and gratitude, because he enjoyed spending time with his beloved, and the young man felt at that moment how close she had become to him, after which he tenderly kissed her hand. This gesture was full of respect and gratitude, as if telling her that she deserved only the most noble and sincere deeds, because in his eyes she was the embodiment of what he aspired to in life. However, despite all his kindness and attention, he could not understand why the beauty's gaze was full of sadness and longing, as if behind her charming smile there was hidden a deep pain that she did not dare to show, perhaps because her heart was still overcome with loneliness. The handsome Sor Alman Salvator slowly released the graceful palm of the beautiful girl, without uttering a single unnecessary word, and only to himself decided that he would never force her to confess, because sincerity born under oppression loses its essence. The carriage took off abruptly and soon disappeared around the bend of a winding country road, heading towards the city, while Sor Alman Salvator confidently walked in the opposite direction, towards the gathering evening, showing neither pain nor confusion. Inside the handsome man, an uncontrollable anger was seething, like a great storm rising from the very depths of the male soul. He hated those who dared to hurt his beloved, and he kept this rage in order to one day turn it into righteous retribution. And so Sor Alman Salvator personally saw to it that the worthless scoundrels who dared to upset his beloved were fully punished. They screamed, wriggled in pain, and crawled at his feet with pleas for mercy, losing the last of their dignity. One of the terrible scoundrels, all covered in red blood and shaking with great terror, almost crawled to the feet of the aristocrat, begging for mercy, promising that if life were granted to him, he would disappear forever and would no longer dare to even look in his direction. As he climbed into the luxurious carriage, where his old friend, the rich Sor Alman Salvator, was waiting in the shadows, he barely managed to catch his breath and said in a restrained voice that perhaps he had been too gentle, since those who had dared to wound the heart of his beloved should have suffered much more. Inside the carriage, he was met by the adult Lars, the Grand Duke's loyal companion and friend, who reached out to him with a casual, almost lazy smile, and a shadow of satisfaction played on his face, as if he knew that justice, albeit harsh, had been restored. When asked if his recent meeting with his fiancée had upset him, Sor Alman Salvator responded with a silent look, from which it was clear that his friend had only stated the obvious. He stood with a frown on his face and his arms crossed over his chest, not hiding his displeasure. His companion noticed, with a barely noticeable smile, that the rich duke had recently begun to frequent the famous company of the lovely maiden much more often, and there was a slight mockery in the man's voice, as if he were teasing an old friend, hoping to see at least a shadow of embarrassment in response. However, the charming Sor Alman Salvator, not giving in to the provocation, restrainedly put his hand to his cheek, as if driving away unnecessary thoughts, and firmly said that he had much more important things to do, and they should be dealt with as soon as possible, without wasting a minute. Lars, barely holding back large tears and hiding terrible pain behind a sad, almost defenseless smile, quietly said that, it seemed, a new job awaited him, another assignment from the master, and in these words there sounded both devotion and a doomed acceptance of his fate. The man's fingers slowly but noticeably tightened on the newspaper sheet he was holding in his hands, and even the rustling of the paper could not drown out the anger that flared up in his chest, awakening a storm of feelings that had long been hidden under a mask of calm and loyalty to the great master. Sor Alman Salvator, whose gaze was full of icy fury, said coldly that he should see the debtors. Cruelty emanated from him, and darkness, like a living creature, enveloped him, partially hiding his face, on which sinister blood sparkled. Several days passed, and the carriage moved slowly forward, as the coachman, skillfully controlling the horses, led them along the winding road, and the wind carried with it only echoes of the imminent arrival at a place where everything seemed to be predetermined, as if fate itself had already drawn all the steps. Inside the carriage, there was not only a physical silence, but also an uneasiness, as if the very atmosphere was filling with darkness. The recent article that the editor held in his hands had spoken of connections between influential people and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and this was clearly part of some dark game in which events were connected. Thisbe Louise Callisto, who was looking through the articles with interest, thought about it while she was driving on business, but after reading the last line, she suddenly realized that she was trapped, doomed to consequences, and her face was instantly darkened by a heavy, viscous premonition. The girl sitting opposite, with her hair in a bun and neatly pulled back, nodded, saying that she too had been surprised to hear the latest news about the criminal actions of the editorial staff, which until now had seemed impeccable and influential. The lady could not understand how such a large and respected newspaper could collapse so quickly. Moreover, she was stunned that their boss, a man who seemed so steadfast and intelligent, had lost in a gambling game that seemed to put their entire future and reputation at risk. Sitting in the transport, the lady discussed what could have happened to the editorial office, because just recently their business was going uphill, and no one could have imagined that everything would collapse so unexpectedly, leaving them in such a hopeless situation where they had to decide what to do next. As soon as the interlocutor changed the subject, the beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto suddenly shuddered when she spoke of an imminent meeting with a rich duke, and her face became less calm than before, revealing an internal tension that she tried to hide, but could not completely. The lady turned her gaze back to the article, telling her companion that everything was fine with the aristocrat, but her face was tense, and sweat was clearly visible on her forehead, which she tried to hide, not wanting to show either weakness or anxiety, hiding her inner unrest. When the girl stared at her in surprise, Thisbe Louise Callisto simply quickly turned away, hiding her feminine emotions and not intending to justify herself, knowing that any explanation would only worsen her condition and would not change the course of the current situation. Her father had previously strictly told his daughter, now an adult, not to leave the palace or go anywhere outside of its boundaries, as her image among the nobles left much to be desired, and he was deeply concerned about her reputation, which could be seriously damaged if she disobeyed his instructions. It was then that Thisbe Louise Callisto realized that it was time to run away from home, not wanting to be a closed flower within the walls of her home, doomed to a life limited by its four walls, where her personal freedom and personal will became increasingly illusory. The Duke of Callisto spoke clearly, with a cold determination like a false saint, arguing that it was much safer for her to stay at home and wait until passions died down a little, until things calmed down and became less dangerous to her reputation, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. However, her father allowed her one thing: to see her fiancé when leaving the house, and this opportunity, like a carefully thought-out move, became a chance for her to escape, because she decided to take advantage of the moment to break free and avoid further restrictions and strict rules imposed on her life. With a smirk, the two-faced aristocrat explained that she would soon have a date with her lover the following week. The white curls of her fluffy hair flowing over her shoulders emphasized her expressive face, which was hidden behind a slight mask of cunning. Her father, although he had no intention of contradicting her decision or forbidding her to go to her dear lover, nevertheless insisted that she take a servant with her who would watch over her and not allow her to leave the house too quickly, providing the necessary attention and protection. The noblewoman sadly lowered her head, feeling how her tender heart was squeezed with bitterness, because despite all her attempts and desire to stay, she still had to leave her home, as was destined, leave everything she loved, and start a new path. She put on a purple cloak, not wanting her appearance to attract the attention of others, trying to hide her feelings and experiences, knowing that her every step and look could be carefully analyzed if someone was attentive enough. Today, she is determined to prevent the death of the young gentleman on the black market, and despite all the risks and dangers that she will face, she is ready to do everything to save him, putting this mission first, despite her own fears and doubts. Time passed, and Thisbe Louise Callisto was once again sitting with her fiancé in the richly furnished room, absorbed in reading the news from the newspaper, enjoying the cozy atmosphere and the soft light that permeated the room, creating a feeling of calm and privacy. Pointing her finger at the image of the precious ring in the advertisement, she told the guy that the advertised jewelry looked a little strange, because in her opinion, it did not correspond at all to what she expected from this kind of product, and it seemed to her that there was nothing exquisite about the design. The young man, not immediately understanding what she was talking about, asked her with interest what exactly she meant, and the lady, beginning to explain, pointed out that the snag was that a black cat was depicted under the advertisement, and it was difficult for her to understand why this animal was associated with such an elegant decoration. The man raised his hand, calling for the maid to bring paper and ink. His gaze was focused, and he seemed to already sense the importance of what was to be done. He was clearly ready to devote himself to solving this unusual mystery that could change everything. After this, he began to write the letters slowly and carefully in a row, writing each one with special attention and care, as if each of them could reveal an unknown truth. And the cipher itself turned out to be not just complex, but mysterious, as if it had been created with the intention of confusing. After some time, it became clear that behind this cipher was hidden not just a puzzle, but something more dangerous and sinister, like a curse, which is connected with the very ring that all this time remained in his hands, not giving him peace and not letting go. In her mind, the beauty realized that such a mysterious name gave it a certain charm, and also realized that it was at this black market auction that Lunette would be killed, which, despite her inner anxiety, gave the situation a special intrigue and a certain mystery. However, in the original, it was completely different. The beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto kills a young boy, and his death was described in horrific detail, in which there was not an ounce of mercy or regret, and every moment seemed to be recorded with cold precision. Her kind fiancé, noticing the woman's thoughtful state, smiled tenderly, and her face suddenly turned red, reflecting joy and at the same time an internal conflict, because her thoughts, like her feelings, were at that moment a complex interweaving of emotions. However, the lady was disappointed and despondent when she realized that the ring had already been sold, and many people in black cloaks with hidden faces standing in the hall had only recently begun to gather, and the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense and mysterious. Earlier, she had managed to send the secondary servant with instructions not to follow her, but to simply run away, leaving her alone so that she could act at her own discretion, without giving in to any outside interference, and decide everything on her own. Suddenly, a man standing next to her turned to her, asking what was wrong with her, and she replied that it was boring and nothing was happening, as if all her inner storm was dissolving in the surrounding silence, not allowing her to even feel how the growing tension was becoming unbearable. It was a man named Malone, with brown hair and a sly smile, always exuding confidence and cold insight. He was a master of the Information Guild, able to skillfully manipulate situations and find opportunities. Malone smiled, and with a slight ironic note in his voice, he noted that he did not expect something so strange and unusual to happen today, as if the whole world had suddenly decided to play its mysterious game with him, as if a harbinger of something important and mystical that was about to happen. Had many allies in the novel, including aristocrats, scientists, and other influential figures, each of whom played a role in creating this complex, multi-layered narrative, filled with intrigue and unexpected twists. Including the beauty, who was carefully watching what was happening, perceived the proposal of the Master of the Information Guild as something holy, as if possessing divine power, capable of changing her fate and awakening in her an inner strength that was previously hidden. The auction was selling new things that attracted the attention of buyers, and then the moment came when a new lot was presented, a bottle filled with aromatic mist, enticing with its mysterious contents and unknown possibilities. The lady held in her hands a letter, or rather an invitation to a mysterious black market event, which she had received thanks to her important and influential connections, thereby opening the doors to a world full of dangerous deals, intrigues, and dark secrets. The beauty responded to the guy's offer to go and buy something with a stern and decisive refusal, as if her inner world was far from this show, and all these deals and purchases had no meaning for her, and attention to such things was just a waste of time that she did not need. The young man clearly hoped that they would buy something new, and he pointed to one thing that was up for auction, a rare spellbook that had that special attraction that could not leave anyone who played such games indifferent. Ignoring the boy's sinister smile and his offer to buy a rare grimoire, Thisbe Louise Callisto replied with cold calm that they did not come here to buy things, but to fulfill another, more important task hidden behind this event. Suddenly, her interlocutor, with a touch of irony, replied that he, of course, had listened to her, but he was not at all the shy and sweet boy she had imagined, and regarding the possible terrible murder she had mentioned, he also had his own opinion, not a very optimistic one. The lovely Thisbe Louise Callisto, listening to the conversation, turned her attention to the people in the corner of the room, where their figures looked suspicious, as if they were not just watching what was happening, but carefully monitoring every movement, ready to intervene at any moment. Handing the bag of money to her assistant, Thisbe Louise Callisto, without changing her calm expression, told him to be extremely careful and to carefully monitor the situation, because in such places any inattention could cost his life. The assistant, without wasting time and realizing that his task was extremely important, quickly went to keep an eye on the other aristocrats to prevent anyone from becoming a victim of evil intentions, leaving his lady alone for a while because her safety was the most important thing to him. And finally, the last lot was put up for sale, a cursed ring, which immediately attracted the attention of those present as an object that concealed not only incredible value, but also a terrifying power that could destroy everything around it. As soon as the ring touched someone else's hands, the girl peered closely at the ring, trying to discern details, but the overly bright lighting in the hall and the strange, almost hypnotic shine of this sinister object only increased her anxiety, making her heart beat faster, as if the ring was not just a decoration, but something much more dangerous. Suddenly, out of the blue, there was another person next to her, and to her amazement, it was her lover. She couldn't understand what he was doing in such a place, because in front of her stood a blonde guy in a dark hood who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He grinned slyly, as if anticipating her surprise, and then, with a slight ironic smile, said that he had not expected to meet her here, in this dark and not quite suitable place, which seemed strange to her, because every detail of his path in this city had always been important to him. Without wasting any time, he sat down next to the noblewoman, slowly, and, looking at her with slight interest and hidden curiosity, invited her, if she did not object, to stay here with him. And although his words were full of confidence and determination, she felt that there was something more hidden behind this offer. Glumly young Thisbe Louise Callisto wondered to herself if the cursed ring affected a person's luck, and worried that seeing her here on the black market would make a handsome man think she was a fraud or a criminal, which she certainly wasn't, and she felt uneasy. When asked if she had come there secretly, the sweet noblewoman answered briefly and a little doubtfully in the affirmative, explaining that she needed to see something with her own eyes to understand whether she should trust everything she had heard about such dubious places. After which, Thisbe Louise Callisto quietly whispered to her companion that this was the first time she had come to such a place, and her voice was full of slight anxiety, because for her this was something new, completely unfamiliar and absolutely unusual, something she did not usually do. With a slight smile and a barely noticeable blush on his cheeks, the man leaned towards her affectionately, as if trying to reduce the distance between them, and whispered back that he was glad to share this moment with her for the first time, feeling calm and confident in her presence. After which he added that before he had really been worried, anxious and doubtful, but seeing her here, in this unusual place, he immediately calmed down, as if all his fears had melted away in her company. And now he felt that everything would be exactly as it should be. At that moment, the man seemed like a real angel, as if descended from heaven, with such a kind, pure, and serene expression on his face that even Louise herself could not help but feel how his presence filled her soul with light, tenderness, warmth, and indescribable peace. The beauty of her eyes narrowed slightly, and she thought how incredibly lucky she was to have this guy, because despite all the unpredictability and dubiousness of this situation, her soul felt that she might be a little easier than before, as if she had found some new hope. The noblewoman, slightly frowning, and with an expression of obvious interest, but at the same time wariness, placed her hand on the man's, asking him what brought him here, to the black market, to this obscurantist place where, as she knew, the most dangerous deals, secret machinations were hidden. The lady stared at the boy demandingly and a little insistently, her anxiety becoming obvious, because she was afraid that Sor Alman Salvator, such an important figure, could be in real danger if he was not careful and did not leave here as quickly as possible. Looking away, scratching the back of his head, the handsome man explained with a light laugh that he had once seen an announcement about this auction, and it had attracted his attention, making him decide to come here, despite all the suspicion and darkness of this place, because he felt that something special could be hidden here. The girl sighed in embarrassment and suddenly realized that Sor Alman Salvator remembered her wish, remembered her affection for this cursed ring that she had once seen, and now he decided to buy it for her, hoping that it would be a worthy gift. The young man noted with slight sadness that the lady had obviously had a lot of problems lately, which, as he believed, needed to be solved, because she was in a constant struggle with what surrounded her, and such things cannot be ignored if you want to live in eternal harmony. That is why the man came here to buy this cursed ring, trying to give it to his beloved, hoping that in this way he could at least slightly improve her mood, help her find the right decision, and restore the self-confidence that she had lost so much. The beauty shyly thanked the aristocrat for his care, although in truth, she did not need this ring at all, because she understood that his intentions came from kindness and a sincere desire to help, which, in turn, touched her fragile heart. She could not help but turn and ask how he had been able to find her so quickly in that huge building. Sor Alman Salvator, with a slight smile, replied that he had heard her voice and, following it, had found her without much difficulty, for to him her presence was always easily recognizable. Seeing a fleeting shadow of beauty, as if woven from the morning light, a dispute suddenly flared up between them, and despite the confusion of sounds and the obscurity of the spoken words, he believed with all his heart that by her voice alone he was able to recognize the one he had been looking for all his life. During a leisurely and tense conversation, like a warm river, one truth flowed between them, and Sor Alman Salvator confidently said that his love was so great that he would be able to find his beloved in any corner of this world, wherever she might be hiding. The handsome man, smiling slightly, with a shadow of tenderness in his eyes, calmly but with clear determination, confirmed that even if she remained silent and disappeared like the morning mist, he would still find her, following what her fragile and tender heart would tell him. Sor Alman Salvator, approaching cautiously, as if afraid to break the silence between them, quietly whispered to her that every touch to her was always special and filled with awe for him, from which the girl froze in surprise, feeling embarrassed and slightly excited. After these words, filled with sincere tenderness, she lowered her head down, as if hiding her eyes from the truth, and with a slight tremor she realized something strange, that in the hustle and bustle of the last days, distracted by the sudden arrival of the groom, she did not even notice the most important thing. A merciless struggle broke out for the cursed ring, shrouded in the darkness of ancient legends and echoes of bloody tragedies. And in the midst of intense bidding, one of the parties, without a moment's hesitation, offered a staggering price: 320 million coins. The host, feeling a strong tremor in his voice from the intensity of the moment, accepted the prohibitively high bid and, drowning out the murmur of the astonished crowd, solemnly announced that the auction had reached its grand finale, and no one would risk raising the price even higher. Thisbe Louise Callisto stood up irritably from her seat and, tensely clenching her fingers, coldly admitted that perhaps the culprit of the previous murders would begin to act right now, and it was quite possible that he was ready to commit a new one. The nobleman, raising his hand with a slight but confident smile, addressed the lady affectionately, as if with cautious concern, reminding her that the moment had come to collect their purchased goods, and in his voice there was noticeable polite confidence, mixed with notes of slight excitement. The young man, who had a truly kind and big heart, and a sincere, bright disposition, without any hesitation declared that, for her sake, even if she turned out to be a villain in the eyes of others, he was ready to do anything, and would gladly follow her wherever she wished. He thought to himself that he would never let this girl get hurt, no matter how dangerous the situation was, and, filled with determination and quiet resolve, he gently, almost carefully, took her hand and led her forward, not looking back at what was happening around him. Walking past the wary, whispering crowd, the noblewoman, feeling the tension in the air, thoughtfully thought about how to protect her companion, who was clearly not prepared for the dangers of this place, because they found themselves in the very heart of the black market, full of dark deals and treacherous people. Malone stood next to her, a slight, almost imperceptible smile on his face, watching her every move carefully and silently. His gaze was cold, but there was something more hidden in it, a mixture of respect and cautious assessment. And he was silent. His words did not matter at this moment, because his task was different. The maiden, as if not noticing his presence, continued on her way with a proud posture. Her companion, strictly following the lady's order, followed her, and their steps, merging in unison, sounded quietly in this stormy stream of people. He was silent, but his behavior was precisely calculated. Malone felt his gaze drilling into him, penetrating him to the very depths, as if someone was studying his soul. However, he remained unperturbed. There was no fear or irritation in his chest, only confidence, because he was ordered to only one thing: to prevent murder. A man in a dark cloak, confidently and easily moving among the dense crowd, seemed to dissolve in its embrace. His figure disappeared without a trace into its depths, merging with the flow of people, and he became an integral part of this sea of faces, leaving behind only a mysterious shadow. With the help of magic, he instantly found himself in a thick, foggy cloud that enveloped him, hiding his presence from the views of random passers-by and outside observers. And in this gloomy space, his figure became elusive, as if swallowed up by an endless ocean of smoke. With a slight and mysterious smile on his lips, he said that he had fulfilled only part of his obligations, without revealing all the details, leaving behind a certain mysterious barrier, which seemed to hint that something much more important and exciting awaited him ahead. The young beauty, casting a quick glance over her shoulder, thought that if she left some of the problems on him, then nothing terrible would happen, because in the end, everything would somehow settle down, everything would fall into place, and all the issues would be resolved as expected. The woman's steps were quiet but confident, and next to her walked young Louise Callisto, who had made a firm decision to help him get out of here as quickly as possible and find a safe place where they could hide from all dangers for a while and wait out this storm. The mansion, shrouded in the night shadow, stood in complete silence, and only the moonlight softly illuminated its dark silhouettes, creating a mystical atmosphere in which everything that happened seemed covered in semi-darkness, hidden from prying eyes and strangers' views. Thisbe, with a determined expression on her face, walked confidently down the long, slightly darkened corridor of the mansion, her steps echoing in the silence until she stopped at one of the walls, pausing for a moment, as if waiting for some kind of signal or listening to the silence around her. The noblewoman, feeling that she had long wanted to return home, thought that this would be the best solution, but her lover, sensing her intention, did not allow her to do this, first suggesting that they take a walk, succumbing to her slight fatigue and desire to be near. The lovely Thisbe Louise Callisto, feeling a little tired, walked forward along the dark corridor of the mansion, deciding that she should take a bath, relax, and rest after a busy day to restore her strength and think about the great future. She took a step forward, her light shoes quietly tapping on the stone floor, when suddenly loud screams were heard in the silence, echoes of which quickly spread throughout the corridor, as if someone was calling for help or trying to warn about something important, disturbing the atmosphere. The lady turned to the side, listening to the distant men's conversation, saying that all this was worth it for the sake of the Callisto family. There was a strange confidence in their voices, as if each event was part of a carefully thought-out and inexorable purpose. Thisbe paused at the door, her attention drawn to the conversation coming from within. They were discussing a false saint whose existence, they believed, was degrading and disgracing their race, creating a shadow of doubt and disappointment, as if everything was under terrible threat. There, inside the room, were some not very pleasant people. The elders of their family, who were discussing how to get rid of the Callisto maiden, whom they considered a disgrace, and decided that her presence could no longer be tolerated, and her fate must be decided immediately. But when Estelle appeared, everything changed. She immediately attracted their attention, and despite all the talk, the elders could not help but succumb to her charm, expressing their willingness to always support the lady with pink hair, whether financially or morally, which seemed an indisputable fact. Thisbe Louise Callisto stood quietly outside the doors, listening as the elders continued to talk about how they wanted to pass on their ancestral sword to Estelle and recognize her as worthy of bearing the title of saint, which they believed was a natural consequence of her merits and inevitable fate. The pearls fell to the floor like stars that had suddenly lost their shine. Her heart froze with pain, and, unable to bear the tension, she turned around and walked away, deciding that she no longer wanted to be part of her family, which seemed alien and soulless to her, deprived of respect, support, and love. Hearing the sound of stones falling, the elders quickly turned towards the maiden, who had been secretly listening to their conversation, and in complete shock, they exclaimed, not believing their ears, because everything that was happening was a real shock to them. Their faces reflected confusion and rage. The pearls rolled across the cold floor, sliding silently underfoot, their glitter flickering in the dim light like a symbol of innocence gone forever and a lost connection. And she kept walking forward, oblivious to what she was leaving behind, completely focused on her decision. The man, the head of their clan, slammed his cane down on the floor, his gaze full of determination and authority, and he said that this was the moment when they could finally express all their thoughts, feelings, and grievances to their granddaughter, revealing to her the whole truth without embellishment, without hiding their emotions. After which, he rudely ordered all the elders to get out of his estate. His gaze was cold, cruel, and full of imperious determination, as if he was ready to destroy everything that stood in his way, leaving no doubt in his decision, as if his every command was law. The men shuddered in horror at the threat, as the man loudly promised that he would personally dig their graves if they did not comply, and their faces expressed deep fear, for they understood that he was not joking. His words sounded like a terrible sentence, and they knew that he had no equal. Suddenly, the crowd rushed towards the door, trying to get out, citing the fact that it was already too late. Everyone was seized with fear and horror, and a heavy silence hung in the air, as if it foreshadowed something inevitable and terrible, filling every corner of this place with anxiety and tension. Thisbe Louise Callisto watched this chaos from the shadows with undisguised curiosity. She saw how these people, clearly frightened and unhappy, tried to find a way out of the situation. But fear and confusion did not allow them to think rationally. Although the noblewoman tried to maintain an outward calm, deep down she felt with increasing anxiety that the wise and far-sighted elders would soon come forward with a proposal to remove her from the family circle, and it would be impossible to avoid this. Suddenly, as if awakening from a long meditation, the rich grandfather, standing at the high window, behind which the evening haze was swirling, turned to his granddaughter and, with slight surprise in his voice, asked when she had arrived and why she had come so late. The lady, with exquisite grace, lifted the purple hem of her dress gracefully, lifting it carefully as if it were an integral part of her upbringing and noble appearance, her movements expressing complete sophistication and perfection as always. The beauty, without stopping, greeted her old relative, making an elegant curtsy before him, reflecting the full depth of her respect and the great esteem she felt for him, despite all the difficulties of their relationship. The grandfather, turning to her, turned away abruptly. His gaze was insistent and demanding. He could not contain his curiosity, and, coming closer, again asked where she had been before, that she had arrived so late at night. His questions were direct, and his tone was strict. She explained that she had arrived in an elegant carriage drawn by 3 snow-white horses, which had stopped near the mansion, and that earlier she had been leisurely strolling with her fiancé, enjoying the evening air, conversation, and the peace that was rare in their lives. After which, Callisto clenched her hand into a fist in front of her, saying in a quiet but confident voice that if her ancient bracelet with the family crest had not broken at that very moment, then perhaps her grandfather's conversation with the elders would have continued, and she would have heard much more about their secret intentions. The man, noticing her tension, walked towards the lady, telling her not to worry, because their conversation, despite all the worries, still could not continue for long and would soon come to an end. As always happens in such situations, coming closer with icy grace and majestic dignity, the Grand Duke stopped in front of his granddaughter, his piercing gaze, full of silent pressure, fixed on her, and his voice sounded imperious and sharp, demanding an answer. Whether she had heard their entire adult conversation, young Thisbe Louise Callisto looked away, her eyes clouded with restrained sadness, but a fragile, forced smile appeared on her face, and, clenching her fingers, she quietly replied that she understood everything and there was no need to waste care on someone who had long been outside of his interests. However, the man suddenly interrupted her rudely, waving his hand almost irritably and closing his eyes sharply, saying that he was not worried about her at all, that her presence did not play any role in the decision already made, and that such conversations were originally not for women's ears. Confused and with a slight tremor in her voice, she lowered her eyes and said that perhaps she had imagined too much, had been too carried away by her hopes, if it had occurred to her that he was capable of worrying about her even a little bit, or showing the concern that she so desperately awaited. Her grandfather had instilled in her from childhood the idea that the honor and reputation of the Callisto family should always stand above any family ties and attachments, because true strength lies in loyalty to duty and devotion to tradition, and not in personal feelings that can weaken the established harmony. Having listened silently to the instructions of her old relative, Thisbe Louise Callisto only nodded reservedly, and without saying a word, left the room, heading to her chambers, where her maids were already waiting for her, ready to help her change her clothes and forget about the burden of the past conversation. Lying on her bed, staring at the empty ceiling, Thisbe Louise Callisto couldn't shake the nagging thought that her grandfather, so stubbornly adhering to his principles, could not accept Estelle, the one who sincerely wanted to be part of their family, despite everything. Moreover, the strange expression on her grandfather's face when he mentioned the beautiful Estelle had deeply shocked Thisbe, causing her to stand for a moment in bewilderment, unable to understand what exactly was hidden behind that look, perhaps hidden discontent or anxious concern. The maids quietly entered her chambers, helped her change into her nightgown, and then, with care and attention, began to comb her snow-white locks, preparing her for a night's rest, while the lady was immersed in her thoughts, trying to find an answer to the question that tormented her. She remembered how, a few days ago, standing on the balcony and lost in her thoughts, the young man quietly approached her. He had a glass of wine in his hands, and the words he spoke were so warm and sincere that they left a deep mark on her heart, filling her soul with light and warmth. The teacher, with a soft and gentle voice, spoke new words that seemed special, saying that she was a true gift that had come into their lives, and that her skillful and selfless actions would bring them universal well-being, improving the world around them. When everyone forgot about her birthday, sweet Thisbe Louise Callisto, while in solitude, suddenly met a servant who brought her a small but sincere gift expressing respect and attention, which once again reminded her how important every detail is in life. But despite all her attempts and hopes, finding true and kind friends turned out to be much more difficult than she had ever imagined. All those who once seemed sincere and close people, in the blink of an eye, shattered like fragile glass, leaving her alone in this cold world. The teacher, who had previously admired her and her abilities, was far from what she seemed at first glance. Behind her back was only the pragmatic goal of using the title of Thisbe Louise Callisto as if it were just a tool for personal gain. The soft pincushion that was given to her turned out to be deadly, hiding a terrible poison within, and it soon became clear that all those whom she considered friends were in fact against her, ready to take any steps for the sake of their own selfish interests. The noblewoman lay on her bed, unable to sleep, her thoughts restless and confused. The light of the night moon, penetrating through the window, fell softly on her face, filling the room with a cold, misty light that only increased her anxiety. Thisbe Louise Callisto yawned, trying to fight off the fatigue, but she couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts and worries tormented her mind. The sweet girl covered her mouth with her hand, trying to keep consciousness, while the silence of the night hung around. She had intended to write him a line, just one short line, so that his heart would not languish in anxiety, but the fatigue of the long day had prevailed, and the ink pen never touched the surface of the parchment, which remained virginal white and silent. A night wind quietly crept through the large window, in which a weak silvery moonlight trembled, slightly swaying the light curtains and gently touching the cheek of the sleeping girl, as if the night itself was trying to gently remind her of something important that had almost slipped out of her thoughts. The lady began to write lines full of tenderness, gratitude, and restrained melancholy, but suddenly interrupted the movement of the pen, and the letter remained unfinished and unsent, frozen in a pause of feelings, and next to it stood an inkwell in which drops of fresh ink were still trembling, like shy tears. The silence of the night enveloped the large white mansion with its marble columns, long shadows, ornate railings, and high arched windows, giving the building a majestic, almost mystical appearance under the silvery light of the moon, as if guarding other people's secrets. The Duke peered at the sheet of paper with cold concentration, as if trying to read something secret in it, and each line seemed to echo in the man's consciousness with an anxious premonition or deep disappointment hidden behind the external calm. To the silent question of his old friend about the reason for such close attention to a seemingly ordinary scroll, the Duke responded with detachment, making it clear with a barely noticeable gesture that the content was of no importance, and with an irritated look he closed his eyes, as if putting an end to the conversation. The young man with green hair and a freckled face, exchanging glances with the others, asked in surprise if his colleague was reading the new newsletter, since rumors were circulating that the latest issue might contain extremely important and alarming information. It was a truly rare and valuable magical artifact, a sheet of white paper on which, once text was written, the same words would magically appear on another copy of the person for whom they were intended, wherever he might be. The secret of this ancient artifact was that after exactly 24 hours, what was written on it was fixed forever, unaffected by time, moisture, or bright light. And thanks to this, it found wide application in politics, love, and even in military communications. Young Lars, feeling slightly embarrassed, still could not contain his curiosity, and raising his index finger, carefully but with undisguised interest, asked whether the Duke used this magical artifact exclusively for personal letters to his beloved, while bypassing official channels. The handsome Sor Alman Salvator nodded soberly, admitting that he had indeed once used this means for the sake of a letter to one who had stirred a man's heart, and immediately before his inner eye there arose the image of a distressed and touching young lady. He remembered well how that day the young and lovely girl looked especially shocked. The woman's lips trembled, her mouth was slightly open, the tea she was holding in her hands spilled, and her wide eyes were frozen in an expression of shock, surprise, and inexpressible confusion. She was deeply concerned about the safety of such an important artifact, which could play a key role in the future, and with an expression of serious excitement in her voice, she sternly ordered her companion to immediately return it back to where it was found. The young Sor Alman Salvator himself, observing her anxiety, could not help but smile slightly, finding her anxiety rather cute than strange, and at first decided that it was worth relaxing a little. But, remembering this, he still felt a little irritated. However, the man quickly realized that the lovely lady probably simply did not hear his remark, since she was most likely already on her way to sleep, absorbed in fatigue and thoughts, and could hardly answer him, having dissolved into the silence of the deep night. The cunning Lars, having listened to his friend, waved his hand with slight displeasure, as if forgiving his thoughtfulness, and with obvious impatience asked whether they would finally be able to complete all current affairs and sum up, reporting to him on the fulfillment of the promised obligations. The young man, feeling that the matter had come to an important conclusion, confidently began to explain that a decision on the issue that had worried them for a long time had finally taken place, and the cursed ring had been received, which opened the way for them to further action. The man's hand carefully lay on the small green box, covered with velvet fabric, and it made almost no sound, as if it were hiding its secret, which was known to him only through subtle touches, full of impenetrable mysticism, ancient knowledge, and mystery. After that, he thoughtfully sat down in a chair, slightly tugging at the edge of his jacket, and quietly said that when he went on an important mission to eliminate his target, there was a strange man next to him, standing at the entrance to the action hall, like a guard or a watchman. The man, frowning and almost irritated, added that this guy had rare abilities. He controlled shadows, and that he knew only one person who could possess such power skills that left traces in the darkest corners of the world. The blonde in the man's eyes clouded over the very moment he realized that the guildmaster was in front of him, the same man who had disappeared unnoticed, like a shadow before he could be noticed, leaving behind only vague traces, as if he was not a person, but a ghost. Lars, feeling guilty and deeply sorry for having let his master down, could hardly contain his stormy emotions, and, unable to bear the weight of the burden, closed his eyes to hide the feelings full of shame and disappointment that, like a fog, enveloped the fragile male heart. Sor Alman Salvator, closely observing Lars's behavior, calmly closed his eyes, not judging his friend and subordinate, because he was well aware that his rival was the guild master, and in such circumstances, the guy's actions were simply inevitable. The handsome Sor Alman Salvator, without taking his eyes off his palms, quietly spoke words full of inner strength that he would not forgive those who dared to offend his beloved, and there was such energy in his voice that it seemed to fill the space around him. The beauty, hearing his decisive words, opened her golden eyes wide, which sparkled brighter than the most precious stones, and with a slight, almost invisible smile on her lips, she looked up, feeling that her defense had now become absolutely invincible, like an invisible wall. She jumped up from her bed, clutching the blue stone in her hand, which seemed not only a symbol of hope, but also a source of anxiety, and, unable to contain her excitement, turned to the guildmaster with a question whether Lunette was alive, not believing the answer that they could give her and feeling her heart beat faster. The vile Malone, standing in the shadow of a narrow alley, looked at her without rushing to answer, and said that the young lady had always been right, and he remembered how he had on a dark and thick cloak that hid his intentions and allowed him not to give away his male presence at that moment. The boy later, having sorted out all the details and collected the facts, said that he noticed a strange man hiding in the shadows, and that it was the Count's son, secretly preparing the murder, hiding his intentions and identity as skillfully as the shadow itself, so that no one could detect him, like a ghost disappearing into the darkness. But as soon as the figure in the darkness was noticed, it instantly disappeared, quickly hiding in dark corners, afraid that its secret had been revealed, like a creature that, aware of danger, hides with incredible speed, as if it did not expect to be caught. The surprised noblewoman, watching the events intently, quietly said that, apparently, the followers were not only strong, but also incredibly skilled, since they were able to see even what was hidden from most, and their mastery in the art of shadows was so deep that it was amazing. Malone was powerful and a master of shadows, manipulating them with such skill that he could control them like invisible threads, building a web around himself and using them as weapons as if they were his own, elusive instrument of power. Thisbe Louise Callisto, speaking quietly through the stone to her accomplice, confidently reported that the killer, sparing no effort, would again try to eliminate the Count's son, because he would stop at nothing until he achieved his goal, and everything had already been carefully prepared for a new, decisive attack. After this, they came to the decision that it was necessary to eliminate all who stood in their way, without delay for a second, destroying them without the slightest hesitation, eliminating every threat that could interfere with their plans, and ensuring themselves complete victory, unshakable power, and confidence in their strength. Sitting on the bed, she still could not understand what motivated the criminal, unable to guess his true motives. Everything seemed too confusing and uncertain, and despite her insight, her thoughts kept eluding the truth, leaving her in complete uncertainty. With a mocking smile, she said that the criminal probably just wanted to leave her aside, to make her suffer, because his actions were clearly aimed at humiliating her. An angry expression appeared on her face, full of anger and contempt, reflecting her inner indignation. As soon as her name was called out into the open air, she turned around abruptly, her gaze directed towards the direction from which she had been called, for she had not expected such a turn of events. However, despite the unexpectedness, her attention was instantly focused on what was happening around her. Dressed in a new blue dress, she began to descend the stairs. Her outfit was exquisite, decorated with blue elements and neatly tied bows, which perfectly matched her elegant image, emphasizing her refined taste. There, below, stood her grandfather, speaking loudly to the elders, demanding that they remember. Thisbe Louise Callisto will always be, past, present, and future, the sole bearer of light, truth, and holiness, giving her words weight and significance. Unable to cope with the storm of emotions from sudden surprise, she turned around abruptly, unable to understand why they suddenly started talking about her, and why at that moment they were so insistently emphasizing her importance, because her role seemed far from obvious to those around her. The advisor, raising his voice to the limit, addressed the head of the clan with persistence and confidence, insistently suggesting that he listen again to all their opinions and seriously think about the events that were taking place, since the situation was becoming more and more complex and tense. The elder, not giving in his determination and authority, firmly supported the opinion that Thisbe Louise Callisto brought no benefit or advantage to their family, but only harm, which caused even more tension and indignation among those present at that moment. But the grandfather, raising his hand with determination and firmness, insistently stated that he had never said that he would not defend his granddaughter, because for him it had always been a matter of honor, and he was not going to retreat from his principles at such a decisive and important moment. The man in glasses, with a slight grin, clearly deliberately playing on emotions, clarified that by the protection he was talking about, he meant exactly the kind of support that she could receive in this circle, and how this support would become key to her future well-being and safety. He then added that in order to effectively and with true dignity defend this lady, it would be much wiser to introduce her as his legitimate daughter, which would greatly enhance the status of her position in the eyes of all present and give additional weight to everything said. Thisbe Louise Callisto, standing nearby by the wall, stood up quietly, trying not to attract attention, and began to listen carefully to the conversation, not interfering in what was happening, but watching with obvious interest as her grandfather and the elder discussed such an important issue for her. The head of the family grabbed his head, in great pain, saying that Thisbe Louise Callisto had always been a true saint and wore this title with pride, because only a few months had passed since it was discovered that the lady was only a fake. As a child, her grandfather never praised his granddaughter, and she could not understand why he suddenly decided to defend her and take her side, as if her role and importance had changed in his eyes. And this came as a complete surprise to her, because her relationship with him had always been complicated and ambiguous. Frustrated and no longer wanting to listen to these conversations, Thisbe Louise Callisto turned away, having already decided to run away from home, because nothing and no one could change her mind that she should be free, away from these difficult decisions and pressures. Suddenly, her gaze accidentally fell on the window, and she noticed a huge carriage, which, as if nothing had happened, stopped nearby, which shocked her and made her tender heart beat faster from incomprehension of what was happening, feeling something strange and disturbing. It was on this day, when everything seemed normal and measured, that the Count himself was supposed to come to visit them in order to finally discuss the most important matters with the head of the clan and the rest of the family members, bringing with him the necessary documents and important news that could significantly change the course of their affairs. And along with him on this special day came Estelle, who, sitting in transport, was visiting the old mansion of her family for the first time, feeling a slight excitement and inner tension from the upcoming meeting with such significant and influential people whose words could influence her fate. At that moment, Thisbe Louise Callisto realized that the events she expected and reality were very different, because Estelle should have been in contact with her grandfather for a long time, and her appearance in this house was a complete and unexpected surprise for her. After much thought, Thisbe, determined not to miss the opportunity, like a true beauty, carefully went down to the carriage, where, gathering her courage, she knocked on the door. Preparing to meet unexpected and important guests, despite the anxiety that gripped her, she greeted her guest with a smile and, pointing a finger at herself, quietly asked if she could spare a minute to talk to her in person, since the conversation promised to be important, and opportunities for privacy were extremely rare in such large and noisy houses. The large white mansion was surrounded by many long corridors, high ceilings, and elegant roofs that created a sense of grandeur and mystery, as if it hid many secrets, ancient mysteries, and interesting stories waiting for their time to be revealed. When Estelle was still very little, she listened with admiration to stories about the saint as a majestic and powerful person, whose strength and nobility were the subject of many legends, inspiring and lifting the hearts of all who knew her, loved her, and admired her virtues. The lovely girl first met the wealthy aristocrat at a hunting competition and admired her great calm and confident demeanor as she conversed with someone, as if she were in her element, in complete harmony with the world around her. And just then, as if from nowhere, a monstrous creature with snow-white skin, huge fangs, and a loud roar suddenly appeared, which tore through the silence of the night, causing everyone in the area to freeze in fear and horror, unable to understand what was happening and what to do. The panicked people ran in all directions, trying to find shelter, their hearts constricted with fear, and only the sound of feet running on the ground echoed, mixing with the terrible roar of the monster that had gained absolute power over their emotions and minds. Estelle, despite all the chaos and horror that was happening, did not lose her composure and always understood the language of animals. So, without hesitation, she decisively spoke to this monster, trying to calm him down and convince him to stop, so as not to cause unnecessary harm to anyone present. Closing her eyes from the terrifying sight, the young girl quickly realized that the beast was actually just scared and unsure of himself. The man's great irritation was caused by the loud noise at the lake, and the people, having woken him up, became the cause of his panicked behavior and disorientation. Fearlessly, she stood up to the loud cries of the people, without hesitation, heading towards the monster, ready to confront him, despite his terrifying appearance and growling, full of aggression, because her determination and calmness were unyielding, as if she was born for this fight. Without thinking twice, she approached the monster, hugged him, trying to convey all her confidence and warmth, and asked him not to be afraid, promising that everything would be fine and no one would harm him, which made the beast calm down a little and feel safe. Then, the others, stunned by what was happening, froze in shock, wondering how this fragile girl managed to calm the monster, which they considered dangerous, and also felt at that moment as if she was their savior, miraculously stopping the catastrophe. Then Estelle stood still next to the calm monster, watching him carefully, not allowing herself to give in to fear. She did not seek to become a new saint, because her goal was not for title or glory, but to protect those she considered important and prevent any possible threat. But the pink-haired maiden had no intention of stealing the Callisto title. She simply didn't want the wolf to harm her idol, that same beautiful lady with white hair who stood nearby in an elegant red dress, like the embodiment of beauty and grace. Anxiety settled in her soul, and, realizing that she had accidentally created a problem, Estelle slowly lowered her head, not wanting to attract attention and ignite a new conflict that she could have avoided. Then Thisbe Louise Callisto approached her, and her gaze, filled with golden glitter, was both mysterious and beautiful, as if nature itself had put an unearthly power into that gaze, which made those around her move with admiration. Contrary to Estelle's expectations, who was preparing to hear cold reproaches or haughty silence, the refined lady with rare nobility and subtle soulfulness unexpectedly expressed sincere admiration for her inner fortitude and strength of spirit, which touched her to the depths of her soul. The saint, with a soft, almost maternal smile on her lips, said several warm, sincere, and encouraging words of gratitude to the women for their courage, because it was thanks to her actions that they had the opportunity to be saved and see a new dawn. When the young beauty again met the one whom, in her heart, she called the ideal of nobility, whose exquisite figure captivated her gaze and seemed to be illuminated by an inner light, she felt a burning desire to stay close longer, enjoying every second of her presence. The lovely Thisbe Louise Callisto, with her characteristic grace, invited another noble lady to the Callisto family mansion, where the high walls remembered the grandeur of her ancestors, and the atmosphere was permeated with an ancient refinement that evoked involuntary awe. Embarrassed but genuinely happy, Estelle made a deep curtsy, greeting the lady with dazzling white hair, while trying to hide her excitement, because she was still worried that her uncle was late and his behavior could create unwanted problems. The lady with the luxurious hair, the color of a blossoming rose, shuddered, thinking for a moment that such an influential person as Thisbe Louise Callisto had condescended to meet her in person precisely because her uncle had somehow caused an awkward situation or embarrassment. Sensing her companion's great anxiety, the noblewoman grabbed her hands with unexpected warmth and determination, promising to tell her everything along the way, and thus tried to dispel the woman's doubts, giving her a feeling of support and peace before the upcoming conversation. The lady carefully took the saint's hands in hers. Her gesture was full of care and inner peace. At that moment, with her whole appearance, she tried to convey confidence and make it clear that there was nothing to worry about, because she was nearby and everything was under control. Mentally addressing young Estelle, Thisbe Louise Callisto, with a slight sadness and hope in her heart, asked only one thing: that she trust her completely, because only in this way she could let the girl into their family with a pure heart and complete confidence. At the same time, in the hall where marble columns rose to the vaults, reflecting the imperious roar of voices, the head of the Callisto clan firmly and unambiguously made it clear to the elders that no one would dare to question the authority of his granddaughter or accuse her of other people's sins. The advisor standing next to the elderly lord cringed inwardly and froze for a moment in confusion when he heard him say with stern determination that now, more than ever, Thisbe Louise Callisto needed the strong shoulder of the family and complete trust in its will. The old man slowly covered his face with his hand, as if trying to hide his regret, and bitterly admitted that he had avoided supporting his relative all his life, which he now regretted, because in her he increasingly noticed the features of his late, once beloved son. Instead of coming to a new meeting with his dear granddaughter, he deliberately immersed himself in endless paperwork, cases, and reports, as if work could drown out the inner voice that reminded him that duty to his family was more important than any government duties. When he was reminded that the young princess was once again awaiting him with hope and excitement, he, without taking his eyes off the papers, would dryly remark that the children usually began to cry at his mere appearance, and therefore it was unlikely that she really longed for a man's presence. The butler, with slight anxiety and a desire to convince his master to show at least a drop of attention to his granddaughter, tried to enter into conversation, but he, without raising his eyes, only coldly answered, handing over a carefully compiled list of all the teachers who would now be engaged in her comprehensive education. Hiding in the deep shadows, he watched his granddaughter's training closely as she fought in the arena with tireless tenacity, honing her fencing skills, as if trying to earn at least one word of approval from him that she never heard. After finishing his classes, he, without saying a word or making an unnecessary gesture, simply left silently, immersed in his thoughts, realizing that deep down no normal child could love such a grumpy, cold, and distant old man as he saw himself in recent years. One such day, little Thisbe Louise Callisto suddenly lost her balance and fell on the cold ground. Her knee was badly injured. The pain was unbearable, but despite her tears, she clenched her teeth, not allowing herself to be weak and not wanting to show her pain to anyone. The maid wanted to immediately run and tell the master about the baby's wounds, but she refused, calmly noting that there was no point in bothering the grandfather over trifles, because he was always busy with more important matters. Absorbed in his own thoughts and concerns, he was always absorbed in other concerns and pressing issues that seemed to him more important and urgent than simple human feelings and relationships in the family, leaving them in the background, and thereby losing touch with what is truly important and dear. However, the years passed, and the old man, having gone through unimaginable trials, finally realized that in this world he had only one support left: his granddaughter, and with a trembling voice he said that Thisbe Louise Callisto was the only one he was ready to protect and devote the rest of his life to. After these words, the man slowly turned to his advisor and, looking into his eyes, reminded him that he himself was a father, and therefore should have understood and shared a man's feelings, because nothing in life can be more important than caring for family and loved ones. The advisor, stunned by his words, opened his mouth in surprise, not knowing how to react. The man's face expressed complete bewilderment, as if he had just heard something absolutely incredible, which came as a complete surprise to him, and he did not know what to say in response. After this, the man, adjusting his glasses, returned to his usual calm, as if nothing had happened, and, after thinking a little, said that he now fully understood what the old man, the head of the clan, was trying to convey, and that there was much more meaning in his words than he expected. Suddenly, with a sharp and loud sound, the door swung open, and Thisbe Louise Callisto, confidently extending her hand, led Estelle behind her, while loudly and sharply greeting the old man, as if completely oblivious to the heavy atmosphere of tense silence that reigned in the room. The two ladies stood in the doorway, feeling awkward, as if there was tension in the air, until they froze in place, waiting for a reaction from the two men. Their sudden appearance caused an uncertain silence and a slight embarrassment to instantly fill the room. The advisor was taken aback by Estelle's unexpected arrival, and the head of the clan, worriedly thinking about why his granddaughter had set him up, felt confused and worried. After all, he had almost convinced this impudent fellow that he was right, but now the situation had become much more complicated and confusing. The Count, having slightly adjusted his appearance and collected himself a little, greeted the princess, and she responded with a mutual but restrained greeting, with a slight smile, as if trying to maintain her distance in this difficult conversation, which promised to be long and tense. Thisbe Louise Callisto explained that when she was returning from a walk, she noticed an unfamiliar carriage. Deciding to check, she went closer, looked inside, and discovered that Estelle was sitting in the carriage, which was not at all what she had planned, and her surprise was quite understandable. The elder raised his hands up, saying that the lady had done nothing wrong, and that sweet Estelle had long wanted to meet the famous daughter of a rich duke, which was her sincere and pure desire, without any hidden intentions or tricks. The young girl, suddenly embarrassed and a little puzzled, froze when everyone found out about her admiration for the saint, and this made her feel awkward and confused because she did not expect her feelings to be discussed so openly in front of everyone. When Thisbe Louise Callisto took her hands again, Estelle froze in complete shock, not believing what was happening, and her face reflected genuine delight, which she could not hide, experiencing this moment with complete surprise and joy, as if she could not believe her luck. The old man chuckled, saying that the Count was right, and that he had not yet given final permission and approval for the guest to stay here, because he wanted to make sure that everything would be decided with due respect and thoughtfulness, and not hastily. This caused the white-haired girl to become angry as they left Estelle in the blazing sunlight, allowing her to suffer, which was completely unacceptable and contrary to general etiquette, violating all decorum and norms of behavior. The grandfather agreed with his granddaughter's words, but reminded her that there would be consequences if they simply allowed Estelle's presence in their Callisto family, since not all family members were ready to accept her in this way, and this could cause serious conflicts that would affect stability and harmony. Thisbe Louise Callisto began her speech, knowing that they wanted to name the new saint after their lineage, but it was important to her that it not be too hasty a decision that could lead to unexpected consequences, weaken the influence of their lineage, and threaten their respect in society. The old man's look was angry and filled with disappointment as he stated that he was not sure he was ready to accept Estelle into their large family, since a woman's presence was unacceptable to him, and he saw no reason for such a step, doubting her merits. And then Thisbe Louise Callisto expressed her thoughts, stating that she did not approve of such bad treatment of their guest, because the noble lady deserved much better treatment and attention than this, and it was not worth judging her so unfairly, especially considering her merits. The head of their great family, with gray hair, was amazed by her great courage and confidence in her words, and, even despite his strictness, he could not help but support his granddaughter, realizing that she was right and that her words had weight, while he still doubted the correctness of the decision. And then the beauty firmly declared that young Estelle should be accepted into their family, because she truly deserved a place among them, and she was ready to defend this, despite the possible difficulties and disagreements that could arise in the future. The girl was from their family, with pink hair, and she had to be treated with respect, as she was worthy of it, despite her youth and sometimes bold statements, which always inspired respect from those who knew her, and her origin added weight to her words. A heated argument broke out between the grandfather and his granddaughter. He stood opposite her, pointing out that she did not realize the full seriousness of her words, that her confidence in her rightness was unfounded, and her speech was too naive, as if she had rushed into the argument without understanding the full depth of the situation. With a slight smile, looking down, Thisbe Louise Callisto confidently said that she knew exactly what she was talking about, and all her words were carefully thought out, because she realized the importance of her decision and the responsibility that it entailed, and her determination was sincere and unwavering. The head of the clan, holding his breath, asked whether the girl was really ready to accept all the consequences of the words, if she knew what was being discussed and was aware of what consequences could follow from the actions, because if she was confident in the decision, it could affect not only her fate, but also the whole family and their future. Estelle and the smart elder stood in shock, not believing their ears when they heard this important conversation, not knowing how to react to such harsh and unpredictable words that were addressed to them, leaving them completely confused and doubting what to do next. Placing her hand on her chest, the beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto stated with dignity that her grandfather had made the best decision. But deep down, she smiled, secretly wishing that she would actually be expelled from the family, which was her hidden and barely suppressed desire. Under the lady's intense gaze, the man could not restrain himself. He grabbed his head, as if trying to comprehend what was said, and, sighing heavily, agreed to do as she wanted, realizing that this could be the only right step in the current situation, after which he looked forward, his hand raised in a gesture symbolizing a final decision, and, sighing heavily, said that he would accept Estelle into their family, despite all the difficulties and doubts that still remained in his heart. But now he was sure that this was the best way. The rich count, filled with delight, clenched his fist, realizing that his goal for which he came here was finally achieved, and the man's presence in this place made sense as he saw his dream turning into reality right before him. But the old man, restraining his impulse, pointed his finger and said that he would only give the name Callisto, and nothing more, and his words were full of determination and inflexibility, as if he were putting a final point in this conversation, depriving the count of any hope for more. Those present immediately felt the growing tension, and many were upset, but there was only one among them who did not share the general mood. It was Estelle herself, who stood in complete bewilderment, not understanding how to properly react to what had happened. This surname with the prefix du always belonged to those who served the aristocratic family, but were not part of the elite itself, which was a real revelation for Estelle, since she did not expect that her own position would be so severely limited, even despite such an important event. Standing next to his granddaughter, the man explained that he could not give Estelle more, because that was the limit of what his family could offer, and he could not compromise his principles for her. Thisbe Louise Callisto took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, and opening her eyes, she felt the tension leave, leaving room for new decisions and unconscious hopes, because this moment was decisive, which could change her destiny. The girl herself, with bright pink eyes, a little upset and slightly puzzled, quickly realized that by joining the aristocratic Callisto family, she would take the place of her idol, become his replacement, which would inevitably change her life, because she could become the companion of such an influential person. Then, in a conversation with that same beauty, she seemed to finally agree to give up her title of Estelle, assuring her that in return, she would gain something as desirable as the titled position itself, opening doors to a world full of new opportunities and amazing prospects. Thisbe Louise Callisto, despite all her doubts, shook her head cautiously, looking at her interlocutor, and said that she had nothing to show, standing with her back to her, in her magnificent red dress, which, wrapping around her figure, emphasized not only her exquisite taste, but also her confidence. Sitting on the sofa next to the Count, the girl, deeply immersed in her thoughts, thought with disappointment that perhaps she had not taken into account all the feelings of the Duke's granddaughter, because she was probably very upset about what had happened, and her experiences could not go unnoticed, because they were sincere. With a determined frown and all doubts cast aside, Estelle made a firm decision to always stand by the good Lady Saint, no matter what external obstacles or difficulties, for her faith in justice and morality remained unshakable, despite all the external tension. Thisbe Louise Callisto, leaving the room and trying not to look back at those present, loudly announced that she would leave everyone to talk, making it clear that she was ready to act at her own discretion, without wasting time on unnecessary conversations or sorting out relationships with others. After that, she left with determination and headed to her personal room, where on her desk lay an important artifact, a parchment that, as she knew very well, could become the key to solving many secrets hidden behind those events that were just beginning, and it could open the doors to a new reality. There, on the old paper, she could already see a message from her lover, written in an exquisite handwriting, and, like a foreshadowing, it awakened in her heart a mixture of excitement and hope, making her think that every gesture and word of his had a special meaning for her. Sitting down on the sofa and gently tucking her hair behind her ear, Thisbe Louise Callisto quickly realized that she had received a reply to the message she had sent him earlier, and her heart began to beat faster as she realized that this moment was important for both of them, as they had both been waiting for this exchange of words. The girl sighed heavily, her pink lips parting slightly, as she realized that these words, although important, could not replace the live communication they once shared, and some invisible distance still remained between them that could not be smoothed over even by a letter. Raising her hand over the letter and holding it in her hands, slightly confused, she thought that a live communication would be much more sincere and heartfelt than such a cold message, left only on paper, which did not have the warmth that emanated from his loud voice. Slowly, she began to read the letter in which the Duke wrote her good morning and expressed concern that she had not answered the previous evening when she arrived home, and his words were full of tenderness and concern, as if he was truly concerned for her great well-being. Sor Almond Salvator, placing his hand on his chest, said that he was very grateful to her for sending him that short letter that meant so much to him, because in that message there was hidden not only gratitude, but also her attention, which was so important to him. The young lady, holding the paper in her hands with a wide smile on her face, realized that the man, apparently, was impatiently waiting for her answer, and she felt so pleased, as if his words had really touched her soul, filling it with tenderness and a slight trepidation. With warmth, her eyes closed, and a dreamy smile on her pretty face, the noblewoman spoke of what a wonderful, kind, and warm-hearted person her beloved was, as if his sincerity and care enveloped her in a warmth that she wanted to keep forever. The letter from the guy turned out to be surprisingly long and warm. He wrote about everything that came to his mind, shared his thoughts about the birds he fed on the windowsill, and every word reflected his gentleness, attention to detail, and touching ability to talk about simple things. The upset lady thought that she herself had not written him that much, because at that moment she was in a great hurry to send the letter, not wanting to keep him waiting, and now she felt a little ashamed of the brevity of her answer, especially when she saw how much feeling he had put into his letter. He asked her with genuine interest about the dress code for the upcoming gala event, which was to be attended by noble and respected nobles, inquiring about what was usually accepted to be worn at such luxurious receptions, so as not to violate the subtle rules of social etiquette. The aristocrat suddenly shuddered, realizing with a slight inner excitement that the celebration would take place very soon, and her heart began to beat faster from surprise, because she did not expect that time had flown by so quickly, and preparation for such a significant event required much more attention. The pen was slowly lowered into the inkwell with a light crunch and a soft sound, leaving barely noticeable splashes on the surface, and this gesture seemed to symbolize the beginning of something important, requiring precision, concentration, and spiritual investment, like any letter addressed to a person dear to the heart. Hastily, and with a slight tremor in her fingers, not allowing herself the slightest hesitation, Thisbe Louise Callisto began to write him a reply, explaining with particular attention that he must certainly come to the celebration accompanied by a companion, since this was required by established noble etiquette. Not even a moment had passed before the aristocrat, touching the large letter with slight trepidation, received the long-awaited answer, and letters began to rapidly appear right on the paper, as if someone invisible was carefully writing them out with grace and gentle haste. The young man, as if sensing her impatience, also received his own quick answer, and in it she asked whether he had a tailcoat for an official appearance, since the upcoming event required a strict appearance and compliance with all the norms of high society. He did indeed have a magnificent silver brooch, adorned with blue gems, made in the shape of a thin sword, to which was attached a delicate chain that hung gracefully when he pinned it to the lapel of his jacket, giving the image a special elegance. The guy thought for a moment, realizing that he probably shouldn't have mentioned pigeons in his letter, because there were much more important and interesting topics for another discussion that could make a better impression on his beloved and bring them even closer together. Having received a sweet and sincere answer from her lover, the young beauty laughed quietly, covering her smile with her fist, as if she wanted to hide from herself the warm feeling that was spreading across her chest, leaving behind a tender trace of inner joy. The lady hastened to write to the young man with lively zeal that the beautiful Estelle had now officially entered their respected family, and that from now on the girl would be under their patronage, receiving protection and recognition, which was an important step in strengthening the new family ties. When asked if there was any hostility or tension between her and Estelle, Thisbe Louise Callisto paused for a moment, raising her pen to her face as if searching for the right words to express her feelings sincerely, but without harshness, preserving the dignity of both. They were both remarkably similar to each other and closely connected not only by fate, but also by origin, because both bore the exalted title of saint, and also belonged to the same noble blood, which seemed to impose on them a common seal of fate and responsibility. Raising her head up and looking at the ceiling with a slight thoughtfulness, Thisbe Louise Callisto could not help but notice that Estelle, despite all the differences in manners and expression of feelings, was the real cutie between the two of them, sincere and bright, as if radiating warmth. In the original of this whole story, which went from mouth to mouth, it was the kind heart, boundless dedication, and noble spirit of the heroine that became the main source of strength, and her body ultimately became the key to saving the entire great and dying empire. The noblewoman, with her innate magical gift, could also cast spells, and when she concentrated, sparks suddenly flared up in her palms, accompanied by a soft golden glow of mana that shimmered like the light of stars contained in her fingers. Briefly, but with sincere and deep feeling, she wrote a reply to her lover, expressing gratitude for his tender care and attention. And as soon as her pen touched the paper, words filled with magic and tenderness began to appear on the surface in shining golden letters. Sor Alman Salvator, at that very moment, involuntarily grabbed his head, covering his eyes with his hand, as if a sudden wave of heavy thoughts had overwhelmed his mind. And with a deep sigh, he said that she was undoubtedly kind, although anxiety flashed in her cold, almost glassy gaze. He gently, but very seriously, and with pain in his voice, reminded his beloved that in this world there are often people who are only capable of pretending to be kind, skillfully putting on attractive masks, and hiding behind them their true, not always bright intentions. The girl, gracefully running her pen over the surface of the parchment, wrote with light grace and calmness that she understood everything perfectly, knew how cruel the world could be, but still asked not to worry about it, emphasizing with her soft hand her confidence and inner fortitude. In response to her touching words about how he could trust her completely, the man smiled reservedly, and there was so much warmth and acceptance in that smile that it seemed like the whole world became quieter for a moment. And then, with a slight nod, he expressed his sincere agreement. Almost without thinking and acting with his usual determination, the cunning Sor Alman Salvator turned over his shoulder and addressed his subordinate, who had been sitting silently behind him on the soft sofa all this time, and this man turned out to be the loyal and always collected Lars. The young man listened calmly to the news that the number of their targets to eliminate had increased significantly, and his golden eyes instantly reflected the understanding that there was much more work ahead than they had expected. Moreover, if two more important people were to die in the near future, the consequences could be catastrophic. The imperial palace, according to preliminary data, could take advantage of this to declare a state of emergency or even gain absolute power. Sor Alman Salvator, without succumbing to any alarm or shadow of excitement, calmly reassured his loyal subordinate, saying that their task was not to kill anyone at all, but that the mission, in fact, consisted of something completely different, a much more subtle and strategically important action. On a dark sheet of paper, part of the classified documents, lay a detailed dossier dedicated to the sweet Estelle, including all possible information about her, from biography to characteristics, habits, magical abilities, and connections. Sor Alman Salvator, reading that this lady was connected to a dangerous guild, couldn't help but smile, hiding his feelings, but a glimmer of worry still showed in his eyes, because he was truly worried about his beloved, realizing that her safety could be at risk. The zodiac, as a sign of warning, will be for the beautiful Estelle, for this lovely lady with pink hair, not just a sign of fate, but also a harbinger of the fact that she will have to go through difficult different trials that can change her life forever. Sor Alman Salvator, raising his cold gaze in which his blue eyes sparkled, quietly said that Estelle would become a murderer in the eyes of society, and her life could become the price she would have to pay for her mistakes, and that one day she would find herself before a court where she would be forced to answer for her actions. The guildmaster was a man with an extraordinary ability to see shadows, which allowed him not only to predict and manipulate events hidden from the eyes of ordinary people, but also to control their destinies, plunging them into deep intrigues and dark secrets. The very name of this organization came from the 12 constellations, each of which represented a key force and symbol in the heavens, forming a great pattern that could predict both heavenly and earthly events, as well as direct the destinies of its members. The guild leader, named Aquarius, was the one who bestowed special titles upon the strongest and most loyal members of the guild, reflecting their unique abilities and merits, with each title not only symbolizing their place in the hierarchy, but also serving as an important magical amulet. For example, the lovely hooded lady was given the title of Cassiopeia, symbolizing her sophistication, power, and the depth of her secrets, and the snow-white star became her title, personifying her radiance and rarity among other members of the organization, like a diamond hidden in the shadows. Each member of the guild held a title based on one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, and each sign granted its owner unique power and influence, allowing him to unlock hidden potential and achieve goals that would be unattainable for ordinary people. However, the serious problem was that one of these signs was assigned to Estelle herself, who, despite her outward gentleness and kindness, was associated with this sign, which gave rise to numerous doubts and questions about her true intentions and hidden power. Sor Almond Salvator, reading a letter from his beloved, pondered her words, in which she assured him that a family connection with an Aquarius was not dangerous. However, he himself could not so easily believe it, feeling the hidden threat that she represented, despite her kind appearance. In her insatiable desire for power, she stopped at nothing, taking everything she could from the Duke's beloved. And now she has decided to get the Callisto family, confident that her wish must be fulfilled at any cost, despite all possible consequences. The cruel man's eyes were filled with a cold, unyielding hatred, and his cunning male face was distorted with cruel anger, as if his entire inner world had been burned in the fire of a merciless rage, ready to destroy everything that stood in his way to achieve his goal. Lars listened attentively to his master, who said that communication with his beloved had now convinced him more that Estelle was a threat, that she had become a dangerous element that needed to be destroyed before she became too strong. Raising his head and looking down, Sor Almond Salvator loudly ordered Lars to go to the butler and instruct him to prepare the best boutonniere for him, since every step, every action must be thought out to the smallest detail, so as not to allow the slightest mistake. 2 days later, when the icy surface of the lake began to melt, the smell of burning paper was already in the air, and the fire that engulfed it drew all attention to itself, filling the world around with an alarming glow and mysterious warmth that beckoned and frightened at the same time. The nobleman sat in a deep chair, his gaze fixed on the brightly blazing tongues of flame, and his thoughts hovered in his head, as if trying to unravel a future that he could not control, absorbed by an invisible weight that increased with each passing moment. Suddenly, one interesting thought caught his attention. Would his beloved be with him? Would she leave him? Would she run away, as he feared, leaving him alone, immersed in deep thought and despair, carrying within herself all the questions that had no answers? Thisbe Louise Callisto, standing tense, suddenly cried out loudly, calling her fiancé. Her eyes were closed from increased excitement, and her mouth was slightly open, as if she was trying to find the strength to answer the questions that tormented her soul and choked her in this agonizing moment of waiting. Her friend, who was standing next to her, covered his mouth with a grin and said that the one they had been waiting for so long was late, which seriously angered the lady, who looked at him with fury, desperately trying to hide her confusion and embarrassment, internally burning with anger. The girl in the blue dress, unable to contain her emotions, ran forward at a rapid pace, and he could barely keep up with her, shouting that today he did not intend to follow his goal, and that, despite everything, her behavior had long since crossed all boundaries of patience and endurance. However, the guy's face suddenly became serious as he uttered a few words filled with aristocratic coldness, hinting that whoever decided to continue this game would be better off keeping an eye on his cousin than on what was happening around him. He became serious and cold, his voice sharp, as he asked the noblewoman how she could have known that his close relative was in such danger, as if he felt that his deepest secret was in danger of being immediately exposed. A shocked Thisbe Louise Callisto froze in her tracks when she realized that she had accidentally exposed herself by learning the guy's secret that Estelle was his sister. And now she found herself in an incredibly difficult situation where every word she said could immediately cause serious consequences. To his next question about whether any of the zodiac had spilled the beans, the girl, feeling acute pressure and growing anxiety, firmly refused, falling silent and looking down at the ground, although her eyes betrayed deep inner anxiety and fear of possible consequences. Then, clapping her hands, she said seriously that all these answers were told to her by the stars in the sky, as if they had become her only source of truth, and her confidence in these words was so strong that it sounded like unshakable determination. With a smile and a deep sigh, the great guild master thought about how his lovely companion had always been a master of lies, capable of surrounding everything around her with a web of deception so that even he sometimes began to doubt his own convictions, losing the firmness of his conclusions. The man, smiling and realizing what was happening, finally said that, judging by the reaction of his interlocutor, there had been a leak of information, and now it was becoming increasingly clear to him that there was no traitor in his team, which only confirmed his own suspicions and conclusions. Young Thisbe Louise Callisto said goodbye to the guy, saying that she would contact him later, and adding that she would take care of everything, preparing to take another decisive step in her cunning game, continuing the path that led her to the inevitable goal, leaving questions for the future. And so, after just a few moments, the guy disappeared into the shadows, as if dissolving into thin air, distorting it with magic, and the lady was left alone, absorbed in deathly silence, with the thought that she had just found herself part of a mysterious game, where her every move could lead to unexpected consequences. Putting her hand to her face, the girl realized that she had unwittingly given away too much information, sharing her thoughts and feelings with the other characters as if she didn't want to, forgetting important details of her life that now seemed so distant and almost non-existent. Slowly but surely, she began to forget her past life, as if she had become deprived of all memories, without looking back, and now saw only the plot of the book she found herself in, experiencing the story of the mysterious monster flower, not knowing how it could end, where the main character, Estelle, having overcome all difficulties and dangers, finally found her love. A feeling of long-awaited relief filled her heart. She, who had survived many trials, could now allow herself to truly feel the happiness that had long seemed unattainable. She walked quickly down the corridor where her lover stood, the disturbing thought hovering in her mind that her memory was erasing all memories of her past life, as if it had been done on purpose, so that she could forget everything that had brought her here and start over. The Duke greeted her with a warm and sincere smile, his face filled with the light of joy when he saw that she had finally come to him. Gratitude sparkled in his eyes, as if she had returned home, and her presence became for him the most precious gift, which he was ready to cherish, no matter what. Gently taking his cheeks in her hands, she leaned towards him, full of remorse and guilt. With a sincere request for forgiveness, she uttered words of apology for all those times when she had offended him, despite all the difficulties and circumstances that interfered with their happiness. Even if she asked him to stay in one place, despite the cold and snowstorm, he, not feeling any cold or pain, would patiently wait for her, blue from the cold, because for him there were no barriers when it came to her love and being near her, despite all the difficulties. When asked why he did not wait for her in a luxurious carriage, the handsome Sor Alman Salvator replied that he could no longer bear the separation and that he greatly desired to see her. So he came here, overcoming all obstacles and taking her hands, as if he wanted to be with her at every moment. They both decided that no matter what, he would never abandon his beloved. He took her hand firmly and led her forward into another room, into a hall where everything was left behind, and their steps were full of determination, affection, and mutual devotion, despite past trials. A woman's hand in a light glove firmly grabbed his strong shoulder, as if seeking support in this moment when their paths crossed again, and every movement of hers was filled with trust and hope that everything in their life would now only get better. The noble woman walked, holding the guy's hand, and with sadness in her heart, she thought that if their engagement was broken off, then their relationship would quickly end, taking with it all the warmth and joy that she felt next to him, leaving her alone and without hope. Sor Alman Salvator noticed that his companion was upset about something, and he could not resist asking her immediately what was wrong, trying to understand what was troubling her soul, because his concern for her was sincere and without hesitation, as if he was ready to help her. Thisbe Louise Callisto managed to surprise him by suddenly smiling and complimenting him, noting that he looked really good today, as if her words were a sincere reflection of her attempt to hide her own feelings, albeit with a little fun and a touch of playfulness. Thisbe Louise Callisto felt her heart pounding in her chest, as every glance from everyone around her seemed too intense and appraising. And in that moment, she hoped that her bracelet would be the symbol that would catch Malone's attention and make him take a step forward. The crowd around her moved, but she remained in her corner, absorbed in thoughts of what might happen when Malone finally noticed her, because every moment of waiting seemed endless, and her soul was tormented by an inner fear of being ignored or forgotten. Thisbe Louise Callisto felt awkward in the company of aristocrats when the crowd around was too large and crowded, and her every movement, every glance seemed too bright in this environment where cold impartiality reigned. And now the moment had come when everyone had gathered, awaiting the arrival of the emperor and his family, preparing for a luxurious event full of wealth and splendor, which was to become a real decoration of the day, filling the atmosphere with excitement and anticipation. After the sudden death of the empress, Prince Kilian Leandros became the heir to the throne. His bright personality, with red hair and eyes, attracted everyone's attention, and his perfect facial features seemed to be the embodiment of beauty and power, leaving an unforgettable impression on everyone. The noblewoman looked gloomily at the handsome and tall guy, unable to hide her displeasure, although she did not fully realize that her gaze was full of conflicting feelings, between great disappointment and a lack of understanding of what was happening. But he was the main male character in the book, the future husband of the sweet and kind Estelle, and his role in her long life, despite all the difficulties, seemed inevitable, as if fate had already written their story, planning their meeting and future relationship. He was still a small mercantile boy, and communicated with the young lady solely for his own benefit, bragging about it to his friends, not realizing that his cold calculation and selfishness left a bitterness in her soul that she would remember for a long time. He was still a small mercantile boy, and he communicated with the young lady solely because he saw benefit in it for himself, which he proudly told his friends, not realizing that his prudence and coldness left a not very pleasant mark on her heart. With a wide smile on his face, as if justifying his ambitions, he proudly promised that when she grew up, she would belong to him, as if by some kind of right, not suspecting that his words, spoken so confidently, would remain in her memory for the rest of her life, turning into a kind of prophecy. The prince was her childhood friend, and their meetings at official events were endless because they often found themselves in the same circle, spending time together, talking and enjoying each other's company, forgetting about the world around them. But she already felt that this relationship could not remain the same as before. They laughed and communicated well, making different plans for the future, imagining a life full of children and joy, and, despite all the difficulties, they believed that only the brightest and happiest moments of life, full of warmth and great love, awaited them ahead. Then, feeling like a naive fool, she began to think that when young Killian learned that she was not such a saint, he would quickly turn away from her, not forgiving her feminine mistakes and disappointed in her true nature, leaving her alone and with her regrets. As the young girl was looking for her old friend, she suddenly heard his voice coming from the room, and as she came closer, she could distinguish among the other sounds his childish laughter, which awakened in her heart a warm feeling, full of hope and love, giving her strength. With a smile on her lips, she headed there, preparing to meet the boy and greet him, but suddenly froze, as if in time, when she heard loud words that made her heart clench from misunderstanding and anxiety, not allowing her to take a single step. Realizing that the conversation was about her, the girl froze at the door, listening with excitement to someone else's words, which seemed to cover her like a cold wave, awakening in her soul a storm of emotions, filled with uncertainty, fear, and anxiety for her future, which was becoming more and more uncertain. With a wicked grin, the prince watched the proceedings closely, envious of her ability to manipulate the saint, confident that her actions could play a key role in his plans, opening up opportunities for him that would be extremely useful in achieving his goals. Everyone around admired Estelle, who walked next to the handsome heir to the throne of a great empire. Her grace and self-confidence captivated the gaze of everyone who was nearby, as if she was the embodiment of nobility and sophistication. Thisbe Louise Callisto stood to the side with her companion, silently observing the proceedings, her gaze calm but penetrating, while the nobles around her were immersed in small talk, discussing the latest events and affairs of the empire, leaving her in the shadows, as if not noticing. After the hunting competition, Everyone was discussing the brave companion, the lady who tamed the monster. Her act became the center of many conversations, surprising and admiring people, but at the same time causing concern in the highest circles of nobility, where they considered her actions too risky and unpredictable. However, since the Callisto clan kept her existence a secret and imposed a strict ban on making new connections, people's curiosity only grew, and the mystery of her past became more and more attractive, like a riddle that everyone was trying to solve. The crown prince held the hand of the new saint and confidently led her through the hall, their steps echoing harmoniously on the marble floor, and their presence in this magnificent place seemed to be an integral part of this solemn event, emphasizing the importance of the moment. The lady's companion watched the couple closely, struck by their harmony, a truly ideal duet. The prince and his beautiful companion, their looks and manner of holding themselves together, created the impression of a flawless union, full of confidence and mutual understanding. After that, his gaze turned to his companion, standing next to him, and perhaps for her it was a heavy burden. She had once been a saint, and now, watching this perfect duet, her soul was tormented by doubts, and memories of the past weighed on her like a heavy weight. Young Thisbe Louise Callisto watched her sweet companion with surprise, noticing how her gaze became distant and her expression thoughtful, as if her thoughts had wandered far from reality and she was searching for answers hidden somewhere deep within herself. The noblewoman, sighing a little, replied that she was fine, but soon, as if coming to her senses, she turned to the guy, asking him if he was comfortable in her company, trying to hide the anxiety that was growing in her heart, generated by the uncertainty of what was happening. Everyone around her was shocked, including the Duke standing nearby, who now also felt confused and tense, not understanding how to react to what was happening and what to do with the situation that was unfolding before him. However, the words she spoke deeply hurt the handsome Sor Alman Salvator. He could not understand how she could speak like that. His soul was filled with conflicting feelings, and it hurt him to realize that his beloved was capable of such thoughts. Estelle suddenly appeared, interrupting their conversation, and with her unexpected appearance breaking the silence, becoming the center of attention, involuntarily forcing everyone present to switch to her and forget about what had just happened between them. The girl was sincerely glad to meet the princess with white hair. Her eyes shone brightly with delight, and without thinking, she hurried to approach, with warmth and joy in every movement, forgetting that there was a prince nearby who also watched their meeting. Feeling awkward in this situation, the lady began to answer that the outfits of Estelle and her companion were indeed magnificent. But there was still one small moment that she could not help but notice, despite her efforts to restrain herself so as not to offend her interlocutors. As soon as the crown prince was next to the girl, the young man, without hesitating for a moment, answered with complete confidence that the lady was his companion and lover, thereby emphasizing his deep connection with her so that everyone present could understand it. He kissed the palm of the lovely Estelle with extraordinary tenderness, and this gesture immediately attracted the attention of those around him, causing a slight movement of curiosity among those present, as if forcing everyone to involuntarily focus on what was happening, warming up their interest. Thisbe Louise Callisto asked her companion to bring her a large glass of cider. He nodded in response, politely said that he would fulfill a woman's request, and, without wasting time, headed to the table, leaving her among the others, who continued to wait patiently. The nobles in the great hall, meanwhile, were animatedly discussing their affairs, connected with political questions, disagreements, and upcoming transactions, being absorbed in important conversations that did not let go of their attention and distracted them from everything else. Then the crown prince suddenly spoke up, asking the former saint if the duke didn't know that the emperor was allergic to apples and that cider simply couldn't be present here, surprising everyone with his unexpected remark, making everyone think about his loud words and their meaning. Young Thisbe Louise Callisto, however, responded with confidence that they were aware of this and that there was no cider here, calmly adding that all these nuances had been taken into account in advance, thereby dispelling the doubts of those gathered and returning attention to the further conversation. The former saint was a very interesting person who could be observed with surprise, Her daring but bright image attracted glances. Clear, bold eyes and snow-white hair made up her image, filled with unsurpassed beauty and mystery. Estelle suddenly spoke up, asking if Thisbe Louise Callisto was in a relationship with anyone, her voice curious but also slightly wary, as if there was more to the topic than just interest, and she was expecting a frank answer. To which the lady responded with a cold refusal, claiming that she did not know the crown prince. Her words sounded restrained and decisive, as if the very idea of such an acquaintance was alien to her, and the question itself was superfluous and inappropriate, which made those gathered tense up a little. The former friends, now bitter enemies, began to talk about how they had known each other for several years, and Estelle, standing nearby, listened carefully to their conversation, trying to understand what exactly was hidden behind their words, noticing how their relationship had changed over time. The young man laughed loudly, suddenly declaring that a few years would be enough to build a palace, adding this mockingly, as if assessing their current situation, and his words made everyone around them look at what was happening from a new angle, interrupting the conversation for a moment. The saint folded her hands in front of her and said with admiration that it was the first time she had seen Thisbe Louise Callisto communicate so informally with someone. Her eyes filled with surprise, and she watched with obvious interest how casually and naturally the lady conducted the conversation, as if all her reserve had disappeared. She came to the conclusion that the young couple were incredibly close to each other, as if their connections were much deeper than just a casual acquaintance, and this made her wonder about the true sincerity of their relationship, confirming her assumptions that there was something more between them. Suddenly, the prince started to play the victim and started crying. His tears were obviously fake, and every word he said had no basis in fact. He claimed that Thisbe Louise Callisto did not love him at all, trying to gain sympathy from those around him, but no one fell for his manipulations. The musicians played pleasant music, and the sound of the violin filled the hall, creating an atmosphere of lightness and sophistication, immersing everyone in a special mood, as if time itself slowed down under the influence of this enchanting melody, which gave the moment a certain magical lightness. Estelle suddenly pushed Thisbe Louise Callisto towards the prince and suggested that they both dance a reconciliatory dance in honor of their friendship, hoping that this gesture would help ease the atmosphere and restore harmony between them, easing the tension and bringing them closer to peace. Killian Leandros, cocking his head to one side and playing with a mocking smile, noted that perhaps it was not worth contradicting the saint in her right to help, since it was useless anyway. The truth was that the lady remained deeply and frankly dissatisfied. A handsome prince in a sky-blue outfit and a young maiden in a blue flowing dress stood majestically in the middle of the hall, where aristocrats danced gracefully to the majestic sounds of enchanting music, shining with jewelry and innate grace. A strong male hand with gentle tenderness, but confidently, lay on a thin, trembling female waist, anticipating the exciting movements of the coming waltz, where hearts will beat in unison and steps will merge in dance, as if an old, long-forgotten fairy tale came to life in the hall. After a short pause, and with a slight hint of playful superiority in his voice, Killian Leandros calmly said that from now on he would be leading this dance, and if the lady wanted to maintain the grace of the moment, she should definitely follow him without further hesitation. Suddenly, at the most inopportune moment, the exquisite heel of the charming beauty stepped unpleasantly on the man's patent leather shoe with an annoying sound, leaving on the surface of his impeccable boots a clear imprint of a hasty, careless movement. Thisbe Louise Callisto smiled tensely, barely hiding her irritation, and in a restrained voice noted that she was well aware of the rights of a saint. However, a frozen, forced smile froze on her face, and the young man ironically declared that she had not changed at all since then. All the aristocrats gathered in this hall under the high vaults and glittering chandeliers froze in silent attention, watching the graceful and precise dance of the young couple, a noble youth and a refined girl, as if they had stepped out of the pages of a romance. At that very moment, continuing to whirl in the rhythm of a beautiful waltz, the two of them began to quietly discuss the fact that their current dance suspiciously reminded them of the very same movements that they had already performed once before, almost laughably recognizable and warm. The guy suddenly said, in a reserved but caustic tone, that apparently Thisbe Louise Callisto really did hate him. And to this, the girl, barely maintaining an expression of calm, retorted that the prince should be honest and admit himself why he brought Estelle here. The heir to the throne bowed his head with restraint, allowing a lock of hair to fall over his forehead, and with cold politeness said that the lady had been mistaken in her hasty assumptions. After all, the lady with pink hair herself had expressed a desire to see the daughter of the Grand Duke. And indeed, young Estelle, sitting to the side, watched his every move with genuine interest and slight admiration. After all, even despite the rumors, this so-called false saint continued to be her idol and unattainable ideal. Then the prince, without changing his expression, suddenly whirled the lovely girl around and, coming close to her ear, whispered almost inaudibly that if she had not been found, he would perhaps have gone outside anyway, just to continue the search. And, stepping back with a mockingly polite grin, he added, as if by chance, that in reality he had arranged all this only to see the lively and spontaneous reaction of Thisbe Louise Callisto, the very one that she carefully hides behind a mask. After this, the heir to the throne, with innate grace and honed to perfection, lowered the lady a little lower, twirling her in a smooth, almost theatrical turn, allowing the dress to fly up like a petal caught in the wind. But suddenly, his face became very serious. All playfulness disappeared, and he quietly but clearly said that in fact he had not come here for the sake of the ball at all. He had come to see in her eyes that subtle, elusive falsehood that she hides behind a polite mask. At that moment, the girl took a step back, as if instinctively, and the hem of her dress flew up with a quick movement. The shoe slid across the marble floor, and a light breeze from the turn emphasized her confusion and attempt to save former dignity. Suddenly, the young boy, hearing a strange, barely perceptible rustling sound, abruptly turned back over his shoulder. His friends nearby were animatedly discussing something, but he suddenly opened his eyes wide in surprise, suspecting that someone was eavesdropping on them right now. The prince, with obvious shock in his eyes, abruptly turned his gaze to the side, hearing a barely perceptible rustle of fabric behind his back. And at that same moment, with alarm, he realized that Thisbe Louise Callisto had been quietly eavesdropping on their tense conversation, and then quickly ran away from the luxurious hall. While his agitated friends were excitedly discussing how the so-called saint could very well have overheard everything and, not understanding the true meaning, drawn completely false and dangerous conclusions, the prince himself sat motionless, smiling calmly with cold determination. Without further ado, he confidently and harshly, in a restrained tone, interrupted his confused friends, ordering them to immediately remain silent about what had happened. After all, if the adults found out the truth, then the heir to the throne would be severely punished first, and after him everyone else. The boys were caught in indecision, with forced but animated smiles, unable to resist the prince, who was younger, but much more determined, stronger and braver than their friend, with whom they once shared the same views on the vast world. The handsome young man watched them with a slight but confident smile, noticing how they tried to hide their confusion and uncertainty, knowing that the prince was always able to find the path to the real truth, despite his youth and underestimated courage. He often saw how little Thisbe Louise Callisto, despite her initial coldness and aloofness, truly mastered her mind, sometimes surpassing her peers in the ability to manipulate the situation and in the tenacity with which she strove for her goal. The girl was sweet, often smiled, her white hair always shone in the light, but it was obvious that she was hiding some deep experiences and worries inside herself, not wanting to reveal them to others and always remaining alone, afraid of being misunderstood. And so the prince, watching the proceedings with equanimity, became the one who portrayed Thisbe Louise Callisto as the victim, closely watching her every move from the window of his office, as if he knew that her fate could be closely linked to his own decisions. The surprised boy froze in place when the lady turned to face him, as if reminding him that they had once been best friends, and this moment became unexpected and painfully significant for him, because they had not communicated for a long time, and a lot had changed since then. The little girl, offended and holding back tears, looked at him with barely restrained emotions, clearly felt insulted by his cruel words that he said to her, and all her invisible internal tension spilled out into this short but very important look. However, the prince did not understand what he had done wrong. Because his intentions were the most sincere, he only wanted happiness and well-being for her. But now he stood at the window, his eyes wide open, unable to comprehend why everything had not gone as he had expected and planned. All the aristocrats watched with obvious interest and curiosity who the heir to the throne was dancing with. And at that moment, even the most strict and reserved of them stopped for a moment, amazed and delighted by what was happening on the dance floor. With a grim look and a forced smile, Killian admitted that he never thought Thisbe Louise Callisto was such a terrible dancer. Her movements were so awkward and uncertain that he could barely keep himself from losing his balance while trying to support her. To the words that her fiancé stood there, burning with jealousy, the lady quickly protested, declaring that the prince knew nothing about her real lover and had no right to judge her feelings and relationships, because he did not know the whole truth and did not even guess what her heart was hiding. Indeed, the Duke stood next to Estelle, watching them with a glass of drink in his hand, his gaze focused on what was happening and his expression serious, as if he was trying to understand something important, hiding his thoughts and emotions behind a calm exterior. The man's face was lowered, and his expression was hidden behind a stamp, as if he did not want to show what exactly was going on in his soul, and sought to keep the secret of his true feelings and experiences, which he carefully concealed from others. The young man, looking with confusion and a slight blush, tried to go to Thisbe Louise Callisto, hoping that she would return to him sooner, because sadness and melancholy reigned in his heart, and his every movement reflected this tension and internal struggle that he could not hide. However, the prince noticed something else, hatred and anger emanating from the Duke, who was clearly jealous of his beloved towards him, and looked cruelly in their direction, as if trying to hide his true feelings behind a cold and detached look, which was betrayed by his tense posture. Having twirled Thisbe Louise Callisto around in a dance, the prince suddenly began to say that he had actually longed to meet her, and his words were full of sincere desire, hidden behind the thin veil of his cold but determined behavior, in which one could sense a hidden, unconscious passion. The noblewoman did not remain silent or try to justify herself regarding the rumors about herself, which said that she was supposedly a false saint and that she was actually looking for a murderer, hiding her true intentions. Instead, she proudly raised her head, boldly meeting his gaze. Her graceful foot stood next to the guy's shoes, lightly touching him, as if hinting at a light and playful game in which she clearly sought to gain the upper hand, despite his calmness and confidence. And this gesture was both a provocation and a manifestation of feminine grace. She kept trying to step on his foot, but Killian successfully dodged, moving smoothly and quickly, avoiding the attempts, and remained confident in his actions despite her desperate efforts and desire to throw him off balance, as if he was playing a game where every move was important and none should upset the balance. The beauty suddenly began to lose her balance, and it seemed that she was about to fall, but the heir to the throne caught her in time, immediately asking her to be careful. Otherwise, rumors could arise that she was trying to kill him with her sharp heels. Thisbe Louise Callisto stopped in surprise when she heard his words and realized that the prince himself did not consider her a murderer, despite their tense situation. She was not capable of such cruel acts, and most likely, it was just a misunderstanding caused by their strange game. After which, with a grin, he said that she could always turn to him if she needed help out of old friendship, and that he would always be ready to lend a helping hand, despite all their disagreements and past grievances that seemed to be in the past. And here is the lovely one. Thisbe Louise Callisto was left alone in the hall without a partner, watching the back of the rich heir to the throne as he left. He was strangely kind to her this time, and this caused her a vague feeling, mixed with bewilderment, as if he was hiding something important. Thoughtfully, her hand resting on her cheek, she sank into deep thought, trying to understand why young Killian was so sure of her innocence, despite the condemnation of her from other nobles who whispered about her case behind her back, not knowing the whole truth. A strong suspicion flared up in the woman's mind that the prince himself might be the criminal, hiding his dark intentions by standing among the crowd and disguising himself as an innocent man, while those around him were oblivious to the real threat he posed. Loud doubts settled inside her, her hands clenched into fists with anxiety. What if no one would believe in her innocence if they pointed a finger at her, and everything would be decided by one wrong look, without a chance for justification, leaving her alone? Suddenly, with a bright smile, her thoughts were interrupted by Estelle, who, looking at her happily, said that the beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto had danced beautifully with the prince, a truly perfect couple who could not help but impress everyone around with their interaction. After this, Sor Almond Salvator approached, with delight in his eyes. He turned to his beloved, declaring that he enjoyed her perfect grace and incredible grace in dance, as if each of her steps filled the space around her with amazing harmony. With a strained, barely noticeable smile, the beauty thanked her future husband, but her face immediately darkened, and a shadow flashed in her eyes, as if she was hiding deep feelings that could not be expressed in words and remained inside her. A man's hand extended to her a tall glass of scarlet wine, in which the red liquid floated, beckoning her gaze and creating an atmosphere filled with symbolism, as if this gesture were a harbinger of something important, hidden in the shadows between them, ready to be revealed. With a smile, Sor Almond Salvator explained that there was no cider on the table, but knowing the lady's refined taste and her preference for good drinks, he decided to offer her wine, being sure that she would appreciate this gesture and accept it with gratitude, as always, showing her unfailing politeness. Not wishing to appear ungrateful and disturb the tender atmosphere, the girl took the glass with restraint, but her hand was already rising to her lips when suddenly an unexpected sound interrupted her movement, and she felt a premonition of anxiety seize her heart. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a strange voice. A man who, having come up to apologize for his intervention, with a slight movement took the glass from her, as if saving her from drinking, although she clearly did not intend to do so, and the woman's face expressed great surprise. It was the prince who, looking gently at the lady, explained that his throat was dry, and so he took the wine for himself, as if by accident, but it was obvious that his words sounded unconvincing, and in their intonations there was an obvious lie that she could not help but notice. Killian, noticing her piercing gaze, barely suppressed a smile, realizing that she had already guessed his intentions. With a bright sparkle in his eyes, he asked her to play along, leaving the whole situation covered in a veil of innuendo, as if it was all part of a carefully thought-out plan. The beauty, not wanting to enter into a contradiction, silently followed her companion, wondering if he was against her giving the glass of drink to the prince, because she clearly felt that the game was unfolding according to rules that they both understood. The darkly beautiful Sor Almond Salvator, unable to refuse his beloved, agreed, but it was clear that he was confused and slightly upset, because he had brought this drink for his beloved, and now she had to give it back, which clearly did not meet his expectations. Thisbe Louise Callisto suddenly stood up, firm and determined, noticing a strange change in her companion's face, as if something in his expression foreshadowed impending alarm. She clenched her fists, not allowing herself to betray her emotions. As if suddenly, as if frightened by something inside herself, she abruptly turned away from the company, and for a moment her eyes widened. The bracelet on her wrist flashed. This meant that Malone was trying to contact her, and the moment for this was the most inopportune of all possible. The man, barely able to stand on his feet and bleeding warm, thick, scarlet blood, whispered with difficulty through pursed lips that something truly strange and disturbing was happening on the second floor, as if something terrifying, frightening, and illogical was happening there. The noblewoman, terrified to the depths of her soul and unable to believe her ears, froze in place, her breathing quickening, for the voice of the wounded youth sounded terribly exhausted, and through his incoherent speech, she caught only fragments of words about terraces, shadows, and the possible danger that lurked there. Thisbe Louise Callisto, pale with fear and anxious foreboding, raised her hand sharply and with desperate insistence, calling the nearest waiter to her, because she urgently needed to leave the room before the situation got out of control or began to develop in an irreparable direction. Estelle glanced over her shoulder, her gaze falling immediately on the former saint, whose expression left no doubt that she was clearly worried about something, tense and wary, as if she had sensed a terrible danger before anyone else around her. Confused, trying to remain calm, Thisbe Louise Callisto turned to the aristocrats and, trying to maintain a polite tone, explained that a close friend was urgently looking for her, and therefore, to her great regret, she had to leave this company immediately. Friends noticed that the princess had a strange expression on her face, excited, tense, as if something was trembling under her skin, but she said convincingly and restrainedly that she would leave for literally a couple of minutes and would definitely return soon as she talked with her old friend. Estelle, worried by this sudden departure, with a worried look in her eyes, extended her hand to hold the beauty, and her thin, fragile fingers almost touched the girl's wrist. But she was already taking a step back, as if trying to avoid the touch, as if she was afraid of it. But Thisbe Louise Callisto pulled her hand away in fear, not allowing the other lady to touch her, as if her skin had suddenly become too sensitive to any foreign touch, as if instinctively defending itself from something invisible, frightening and disturbing inside her. Without turning around, Thisbe Louise Callisto turned away abruptly and walked away quickly, leaving the aristocrats behind in mute confusion, and almost inaudibly muttered that she would definitely return soon, and her hand involuntarily rose to her shoulder as if in a chill, pain, or internal tension. The aristocrats, as well as her closest friends, were clearly stunned by this strange and abrupt behavior of Thisbe Louise Callisto, and stood frozen in place in complete confusion, with their eyes wide open. Both the young men and Estelle herself, who stood between them in complete confusion. The noblewoman, in a luxurious dark blue dress, with flowing waves that emphasized her grace, with silver hair decorated with neat bows, walked quickly and decisively towards the exit of the hall, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. Estelle, her golden eyes wide open, watched the girl's every step with alarm, feeling her heart squeeze with worry. An inner sense of uncertainty and tension told her that something strange, disturbing, and perhaps even dangerous was happening to the former saint. And behind Estelle, as if on command, hidden voices began to stir. Other nobles gathered around, already hastened to condemn the girl's strange behavior, whispering that even a former saint could well be a murderer masking her sins. Estelle felt a sudden sense of guilt as she remembered how well Thisbe Louise Callisto had treated her before. She suddenly felt ashamed of herself, since perhaps it was her presence that had started the rumors of her involvement with the mysterious lady, leading to such a misunderstanding. Thisbe Louise Callisto's face showed that something was troubling her greatly, and instantly the girl pulled her hand away from the light grip of the beautiful Estelle, as if this gesture was an instinctive attempt to avoid something dangerous, after which she quickly left. Without losing time, the good Estelle, feeling great anxiety and a desire to remedy the situation, resolutely went forward, loudly announcing to her companions that she was going to follow the fleeing aristocrat and would definitely find out what had happened in order to help her. The prince extended his hand towards her, trying to stop the sweet lady, shouting for her to stay and not leave. But it was too late. She was already walking towards the huge door, trying to leave the luxurious hall. Her steps sounded louder and louder, desperately breaking the silence. As a result, the young guys were left alone together. The blonde was clearly upset, and the prince, with a displeased expression on his face, extended his upper hand, trying to calm down, but clearly could not hide his terrible anxiety and dissatisfaction, which only increased the tension in the air. Thisbe Louise Callisto hurried forward, holding her skirt with her hand, breathing heavily, her face expressing tension, and she felt how each step became heavier. She had to hurry because time was against her, and she felt that something serious was waiting for her. After the words of the female friend, the precious bracelet fell silent, and no news came from it, which was very alarming because she had already begun to worry about what might happen and did not know how to act in such an unpredictable situation. Biting her lip in frustration, worried that Malone might have gotten hurt, Thisbe Louise Callisto couldn't help but blame herself for her carelessness, knowing that her actions in the past might have caused this, and now she might have to pay for her carelessness. Upon entering the room, she immediately exclaimed, calling her friend's name loudly, her voice full of anxiety, as if she already had a premonition that she might find herself in front of a terrible sight, and it was difficult for her to accept that something terrible could happen to him. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, her mouth was covered by someone's hand. A person, quick and stealthy, appeared from behind, not giving her a chance to utter a word. His actions were precise and decisive, leaving Thisbe in complete confusion and bewilderment. Malone stood in front of her, covered in blood and wearing a cloak. His face was distorted with pain, and his gaze was full of fatigue, as if he was trying to hide his pain and worries. He quietly whispered, asking her to be quieter, while lowering his head, and Thisbe could hardly believe that what was happening in front of her was real. The aristocrat's face twisted in horror as her gaze fell on the traces of blood and visible wounds on her friend's body. The big heart of the beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto sank, and she could hardly contain her emotions, seeing the terrible state Mr. Malone was in, feeling an inner anxiety. Facing her own fear, Thisbe Louise Callisto walked towards him without hesitation, offering her body to support him, wrapping her arms around his heavily breathing body, trying to convey to him at least some of her strength and confidence, unable to hide her concern. Malone, in his despair, joyfully admitted that he knew the lady would definitely come to his aid. Despite his pain, he was grateful that she was there. However, his condition remained critical. He was almost losing consciousness, his body, as if empty, suffered from terrible exhaustion and demonic power. Gently but anxiously, she touched his body, feeling his trembling muscles contract from the cold, and laid him on his back so he could rest a little, although the wound on his stomach was serious, and it caused real fear for his life in her heart. The girl felt the blood slowly seeping through the wound. She knew that it was impossible to stop the bleeding, but if she did not try to stop it, the man would definitely die. And there was very little time to make a decision, and she could not lose a minute. The young man took a deep breath, opening his mouth to try and control his heavy breathing. Blood was dripping from his chest, and it was obvious that the wound was too deep. He was almost losing consciousness, desperately fighting for his life despite the terrible pain and weakness that was taking over him. The noblewoman stood up abruptly, realizing that there was no other way, and she had only one chance to save her friend, and his life depended on how she acted now. And this thought gave her strength, despite the terrible feeling of anxiety and fear of possible consequences. Taking the key, she inserted it into the lock, and, feeling the cold metal slide over her fingers, she turned it. A muffled click confirmed that the door was open, and she wasted no time, deciding that she must act immediately, otherwise all would be lost, and the chance would be gone forever. After that, as if she had a presentiment that someone might see her, she closed the curtains so that what was happening could not be seen from the window, because no one should know what she was going to do at that moment, and this secret remained only hers, hidden from prying eyes like an ancient secret. She concentrated, calling upon the magic, calling upon the signs of the zodiac to come to her aid, and her hand hovered in the air as she began to speak words filled with power and ancient wisdom, hoping that the stars would see her intentions and respond at the right moment, ready to support her. The signs of the zodiac began to help people. Their incredible magic, like an invisible force, blossomed, filling hearts with confidence, and the bright constellations shone like a reliable guide, directing them to the right path and opening doors to new opportunities and strength. Thisbe Louise Callisto has practiced the art of zodiac summoning for many years and has perfected her magic, seeking to unlock the secrets of the stars and increase her power in order to use these forces to achieve her ambitious goals and aspirations. Typically, a magician could only be associated with 6 constellations, each of which represented a specific attribute, granting the magician a unique power that corresponded to his nature and capabilities, as well as determining his role in the world and the tasks he was supposed to perform. The noblewoman's strength lay in the fact that, unlike other magicians, she had no attachment to any particular attribute, but could connect with each of the 12 signs of the zodiac, thereby opening up unlimited possibilities for the use of magic. The lady took a step forward, her shoe barely touching the cold ground, as if gently penetrating the silence, filling the space around her with lightness and determination, creating the impression that the earth itself responded to her presence, accepting her steps into its own rhythm. Mysterious creatures suddenly appeared around the beauty, who, as if sensing her inner call, turned to her, demanding an explanation of what she wanted from them and why such an inexorable determination was hidden in her eyes, as if death was already near. Before her stood deities, half human and half beast, whose gazes were full of ancient wisdom and mystery. All of them were merely observing the feminine actions, but, responding to her call, they began to gather around, ready to intervene if her request was justified. Frowning and gathering all her will, the beautiful Thisbe Louise Callisto resolutely shouted that the stars and constellations must help her, because her faithful friend was in mortal danger, was seriously wounded, and now only the power of magic could save his life. Aquarius, without the slightest hesitation, looked at her and said that she had too little mana to hope for help, and therefore her request was doomed to failure, because without the power of magic, she was too vulnerable and unprepared for the terrible trials. Young Thisbe Louise Callisto, not giving in, began to confidently assert that all the signs of the zodiac could help her, to which the blue Aquarius responded that her approach was arrogant and stupid, because she did not take into account the real power that lies behind the magic of the stars. There were several ways to use the zodiac magic, one of which was to partially borrow their power, allowing the magician to draw mana from the heavenly sources, keeping the light in his hands and directing it to protect his loved ones. The second option was a temporary manifestation of inner power when some magician used great mana to reveal the power of the constellation within himself, allowing the energy to penetrate the male body and direct it in the right direction, expanding possibilities. There was also a third way in which the summoner did not limit himself to simply interacting with the constellation, but fully awakened its power, directly connecting himself with the celestial object, allowing the star to act through his body and will, embodying power. Suddenly, Aries spoke to her, his voice full of energy and determination. He said that she was just a beginner, who did not have enough power to control the magic of the constellations, and even her grimoire was not powerful enough for serious spells. But the lady was not embarrassed and fought back, decisively telling the constellations that if they were not going to help her, they could have simply gone away and left her alone, without interfering with her acting at her own discretion, because she did not depend on their will and was ready to cope on her own, without waiting for their support. The noblewoman, expressing her anger and not hiding her rage, said sharply that if these zodiacs were unwilling to help her, then she could easily call on others who were more willing to come to her aid in her need, not paying attention to their reluctant and cold attitude, which only further strengthened her determination. Aries liked such determination, and he replied that, apparently, the lady was not just a child, but a brave and determined child, ready to fight for her goal, despite all the difficulties that stood in her way, and for which she was ready to risk everything to achieve her dream. Thisbe Louise Callisto continued to stand up straight. The woman's fortitude was unbending, and she was not going to leave, frowning and holding back her patience, because this was the moment when she could not afford to doubt or retreat, despite all the different obstacles. Finally, the great Aries decided that he was delighted with her determination, and, smiling slightly, said that he could now help her, because she had asked him, and apparently was in great need of his support and help, which she was so desperately seeking at that moment. After making sure that the call was successful, the lovely Thisbe Louise Callisto could not help but smile, realizing in surprise that she had succeeded and achieved what seemed impossible, because her will and determination became the decisive factor that opened the way to victory. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a completely new voice, and another zodiac walked towards them. Its presence felt instantly, as if the air around them had changed, filled with new energy, creating an atmosphere full of tension and anticipation, as if an important moment was approaching. He was a young man, his gaze was penetrating, and, slightly bowing his head, he said with respect that he had always valued such qualities in people as honesty and determination. the ability to fight without giving up, despite all the difficulties encountered along the way. Virgo felt her heart beat faster. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. Her gaze involuntarily froze, because now the strong Sagittarius himself spoke to her. There was strength, confidence, and boundless determination in his voice, filling her with its influence. And then Aquarius, with slight contempt, turned to the lady, calling her a fool, because she believed that he hated her, which only strengthened her determination and strengthened her faith in her own strength, despite his caustic remark. And she no longer doubted her choice. The beauty felt confident when the zodiac signs approached her, asking what they could do, because they were ready to help, ready to lend a shoulder and offer their strength to provide support in a difficult moment. And this was important to her. With confidence and determination, the noblewoman replied that the signs should not worry, because real professionals would do what they do best, and they should not worry because she herself would handle what she needed to do, without wasting precious time on doubts. Sor Alman Salvator stood on the balcony, immersed in emptiness, his gaze directed into empty space, and the expectation of his beloved became more and more unbearable. His patience melted with every moment, turning this time into a real agonizing test for the soul. Suddenly, feeling someone's gaze on him, Sor Alman Salvator reluctantly turned his head, meeting the gaze of his interlocutor, who was standing nearby, as if he was specially waiting for the moment to intervene in this tense atmosphere. Filling it with even more tension, the crown prince stood before him, a sly grin adorning his face, and in a slightly mocking tone, he said that the nobleman had overreacted to the absence of his beloved, almost flirting with his nervousness and inner turmoil. Sor Alman Salvator turned away, folding his arms across his chest, and with a cold expression on his face, said that it was the first time he had met the heir to the throne, although his gaze remained impenetrable, hiding his true thoughts behind a mask of restraint, as if he were above all these petty intrigues. The prince, smiling mockingly, stretched out his retort, assuring that the lovely noblewoman was naive and had no idea how vile and cunning this duke could be, how he manipulated situations and people for his own benefit. Sor Alman Salvator recoiled from these loud words, as if they were a blow to him, and, not wishing to continue the conversation, he said in a reserved manner that he would no longer hold a conversation with such a man, preferring to leave his words unanswered, since their conversation had no meaning. The grown man, listening to someone else's conversation, could not help but notice how the heir to the throne, clearly showing interest in her, said that the duke did not know the true nature of his beloved, emphasizing that she was not at all what he thought. The prince's words suddenly made Sor Alman Salvator freeze, and he felt a jealousy flare up inside him that he had not even suspected. For the prince, his beloved was something special, and this discovery shocked him, breaking his usual order. Meanwhile, the handsome heir to the throne, without hiding his desire, grabbed her by the hand and, without giving her a chance to come to her senses, whirled her around in a waltz, as if her presence were his complete and only victory, and the waltz itself became a symbol of his power over the situation. Thisbe Louise Callisto behaved completely differently when in the presence of the future king. She barely contained her true emotions, which were not hidden from prying eyes. Her face betrayed obvious irritation, and she tried to hide her inner discontent, but did not demonstrate it too clearly. The duke, watching the dancing couple, could not hide his anxiety and jealousy. In his eyes there was not only envy, but also anger, because his beloved was there, and next to him stood Estelle, who seemed pleased with what was happening, rejoicing for her friend and the prince, as if this were her personal victory. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by a strange voice, which loudly and insistently called the blonde, and everyone present, as if on command, instantly turned their gaze towards the source of the sound, thereby breaking the tense atmosphere that reigned among them. It was Thisbe Louise Callisto, who, breathing heavily, with every step she took, showed more and more weariness and anxiety. Approaching her future husband, she turned to him with deep sincerity in her eyes, asking his forgiveness for leaving him alone at such an important moment. Sor Alman Salvator hurried up to the beautiful lady, with a bright smile and a shining blush on her cheeks, rejoicing at her appearance. He was happy to see her, and the prince standing next to him noticed this and decided to start a conversation, hoping to attract her attention. He thought to himself that everything that was happening was nothing more than part of a carefully thought-out game in which even an acquaintance with an influential duke could change the course of events, but intervention promised provocation, and the goal had not yet been achieved. The man was clearly hiding something. It was evident in his intense gaze. He silently watched his beloved, who, unable to hide her embarrassment and pain, hurried away, leaving him alone with sudden confusion and anxiety. Sor Alman Salvator wasted no time enjoying the presence of his beloved, having a wonderful time with her, watching with joy how she communicated with a close friend, and her response was full of confidence and agreement. Smiling slightly, as if she were hiding a tender mystery, the young girl said in a soft, almost whispering voice that her close friend would be truly upset if she were to delay even for a minute, and there was genuine concern in her words. Images from the past came to her mind. Moments when she had asked astrologers with warm conviction not to worry unnecessarily, but simply to do their job the way they did best, with confidence, calm, and inner light. All the signs of the zodiac, driven by anxiety and hope, tried with all their might to help the beautiful sorceress regain her lost magical power, because her mana was almost exhausted, and without support, she could not complete the mysterious spell she had begun. But the charming sorceress, with a mysterious smile on her lips and a sparkle in her eyes, only quietly, almost in a whisper, answered that she knew one truly amazing and very rare way that could help her pull off this difficult magic trick. A light, barely perceptible vibration of magic filled the air around, and snow-white glowing traces, like ghostly patterns, smoothly stretched along the stone walls, leaving behind a shimmering trail of living mana, ready to break out into a spell. The beautiful sorceress, despite her fatigue, with firmness in her voice, told the signs of the zodiac not to worry about her magic and mental powers, but instead to focus on managing the flow of mana, because it was now the key to their salvation. Aquarius, without a second's hesitation, approached the seriously wounded boy, looked at his pale face, and quietly said that the life energy in him had almost died out, but if everything was done correctly, it was still possible to try to bring him back to life. With these words filled with determination, the zodiac sign began to cast an ancient spell. A soft glow of white mana swirled in the air and rushed towards the wound, penetrating it with light that heals the flesh and glues the soul to the body again. Before these dramatic events, the master, one of the most devoted mages of the guild, was always by the count's side, protecting him from invisible threats and dark forces, following him through the gloomy corridors of the ancient castle, in a dark cloak with a sword on his belt, like a silent shadow, completely devoted to his master. Suddenly, there was a terrible, deafening blow, and the young mage, seized with panic, instinctively raised his hand, trying to defend himself, his golden eyes wide with fear, reflecting on themselves the whole storm of the coming disaster, like lightning that cuts through the darkness before the storm. At that very moment, Sagittarius, without losing her composure, confidently pulled the string of the sparkling bow, put all her will into the arrow, and firmly said that she would never let the sorceress down, promising to protect her, even if she had to sacrifice herself. Ares, on the contrary, was clearly irritated and did not try to hide his anger. He was deeply outraged that he was treated only as a silent guard, used without warning, and any demand, like a helpless tool, not given the opportunity to make important decisions himself. Meanwhile, Aquarius, remaining unperturbed, quietly stood next to the sorceress, leaned over, and almost whispered in her ear that she had not betrayed them at all, but, on the contrary, entrusted the rescue of the wounded young man to them, knowing full well that their strength and loyalty were capable of conquering fear and doubt. And after all these events, a little girl with blue eyes as clear as the spring sky explained that the sorceress's anxious excitement was transmitted through subtle streams of mana, penetrating the consciousness of all the signs of the zodiac and reflected in their emotions. Having understood the true cause of the unrest, the noblewoman, without losing a second, hurried back to where her beloved prince remained, and, approaching, looked him straight in the eyes, and he, without saying a word, stood next to her in complete silence,